The neon light of the Budweiser sign flickered, casting a rhythmic, sickly pale glow over the scarred mahogany of the bar top. Jason's fist didn't just move. It blurred, a heavy mass of bone and muscle that stopped with jarring suddenness barely an inch from Emily's cheek. The air displaced by the punch ruffled her hair, a cold draft in the sweltering heat of the crowded dive bar. Half a pint of lukewarm lager sloshed over the rim of his glass, drenching the shoulder of her worn flight jacket. Jason didn't apologize. Instead, he leaned in, his breath a foul mixture of cheap cigarettes and even cheaper beer, his eyes bloodshot and narrow. He looked like a man who had spent the last 3 hours looking for a reason to burn something down. His voice was a low, jagged rasp that cut through the country music playing on the jukebox. He asked her if that mutt of hers actually did anything, or if she was just another fake riding the system, using a vest to get a free pass. As he spoke, flecks of spit landed on the collar of her jacket. He wasn't just talking, he was venting a lifetime of unearned bitterness. His Marine Corps tattoo, the eagle, globe, and anchor, flexed and distorted on his bicep as he reached out with his other hand, grabbing Emily's shoulder with enough force to make her glass tip dangerously on the coaster. The bar, which only moments ago had been a cacophony of laughter and clinking glasses, suddenly fell into a suffocating silence. It was the kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. The regulars froze mid-sip, their eyes darting between the massive, aggressive man and the slight, motionless woman sitting at the corner of the bar. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her gaze remained fixed on the middle distance, calm and terrifyingly empty. But beneath her stool, the atmosphere had changed. The German shepherd, a massive beast with a coat the color of midnight and desert sand, didn't bark. He didn't growl. Instead, he simply stood. The movement was fluid, like oil pouring over silk. His lips peeled back in a slow, deliberate snarl, revealing teeth that looked more like ivory daggers than anything belonging to a household pet. This was a predator, one trained for the darkest corners of the world, and he had just identified a target. Jason's drunk, pride-clouded brain finally registered what his eyes had been ignoring. His gaze dropped to the dog's harness, specifically to the small, subdued patch on the side. It wasn't a standard service dog emblem. It bore the insignia of Special Warfare Command. The arrogance that had been fueling his tirade drained out of his face in a sickeningly fast wave, leaving his skin the color of wet parchment. A soft whisper broke the silence from a few stools down. Someone muttered that he had just assaulted a high-ranking officer. The weight of that realization began to settle into the room like lead. Emily's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her glass. It was the only sign of tension she gave. She didn't look up, refusing to give Jason the satisfaction of a reaction. To a man like Jason, silence was a vacuum that he felt compelled to fill with noise and bravado. He didn't read her stillness as a warning. He read it as submission. In his world, if you weren't screaming back, you were losing. He leaned closer, his boots heavy and flat-footed on the wooden floorboards, each shift of his weight an attempt to reclaim the territory he felt he was losing. He raised his voice, demanding to know if she was one of those weekend warrior types who thought a vest and a dog made them special. One of his companions, a shorter man with a nervous energy and a fresh buzz cut named Martinez, reached out to touch Jason's arm. He pleaded with him to just leave her alone, his voice cracking with the realization that they were standing on the edge of a very steep cliff. Jason didn't even look at him. He snapped at Martinez to shut up, his eyes locked on Emily with the kind of hyper-focused intensity that only comes from a specific stage of intoxication. He claimed he was just asking a question, maintaining that she could handle a simple question. Finally, Emily looked up. Her eyes weren't filled with the anger Jason expected. They were steady, clear, and hauntingly calm. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things that would make the average person's heart stop. Someone who had operated in environments where a mistake didn't mean a bruised ego, but a body bag. She spoke simply, her voice low and even devoid of the theatricality Jason was putting on. She told him the dog was working and that they were just there for a quiet drink. Jason let out a bark of a laugh, a harsh, jagged sound that lacked any real mirth. He mocked the idea of the dog working, asking if he was working on looking cute or begging for treats. His friends were shifting uncomfortably now, the collective energy of their group curdling. They could feel the shift in the room, the way the other patrons were beginning to lean away, but Jason was caught in the gravity of his own ego. He couldn't stop if he wanted to. He sneered, guessing that it was PTSD anxiety or that she just liked the priority parking spots. The bartender, a man whose face was a roadmap of a long life and many late shifts, leaned over the counter. He was an older guy with gray stubble and eyes that had seen 1,000-bar fights start and end. He tried to intervene, telling Jason that maybe he should move along. Jason wheeled on him, chest puffed out like a fighting bird. He shouted that he was a Marine and that he had earned the right to ask questions. He gestured wildly toward Emily, claiming she was sitting there acting like a hero while he was expected to just nod and smile. Emily's voice cut through his shouting like a scalpel through silk. She told him that actually he wasn't supposed to do anything. She told him he was supposed to mind his own business and let her finish her drink. The bluntness of it hit Jason like a physical blow. His face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He accused her of having an attitude and took another step into her personal space. Ace, the dog, tracked the movement with chilling precision. His eyes flickered up for a fraction of a second, marking the closing distance. Jason began a tirade about her generation's sense of entitlement, claiming she thought she was special just for putting on a uniform. Emily tilted her head, a small, dangerous gesture. She asked him if he didn't feel the same way about himself. The question hung in the air. A lit match dropped into a pool of gasoline. Jason jabbed a finger toward his own chest, declaring that he had earned his place through blood, sweat, and real combat deployments, not by sitting behind a desk pretending to be a warrior. Emily's response was quiet, almost a whisper. She told him he had no idea what she did. Jason shot back that he knew exactly what she was. He called her a quota, a diversity hire for the Navy who had been handed a rank and a pat on the head to look good on recruitment posters. The cruelty of the words didn't seem to register with him, but they hit everyone else in the room like a physical weight. Martinez stood up abruptly, his face pale as a ghost. He begged Jason to stop, but Jason was far beyond listening. He spun to face his friend, demanding to know why he should stop, asking if it was because she might cry. He turned back to Emily, leaning down until he was mere inches from her face, his breath hot and stale. He told her that the real military didn't care about her feelings. Emily's jaw tightened, the only outward sign that the venom in his words was being processed. Ace's head lifted, his dark eyes fixed on Jason with an intensity that would have made a sober man flee the building. Emily asked him if he was done. Jason laughed again, claiming he was just getting started. He told her that girls like her made the rest of them look bad, pretending to be tough with an emotional support animal, while guys like him did the real work. He called it the participation trophy generation. The bartender's voice was sharp now, a final warning. He told Jason that was enough. But Jason was past the point of no return. He shouted that it wasn't nearly enough, that he was sick of pretending everyone was equal. He gestured at Emily with pure disgust, claiming some people earned their place while others just showed up with the right biology. Emily stood up. The movement wasn't fast, but it was perfectly controlled, a testament to training that had become part of her muscle memory. Ace stood with her, silent and deadly, positioning himself slightly ahead and to her left. His entire body language shifted from a resting state to a coiled spring. Jason, misreading the situation entirely, told her she should sit back down before she embarrassed herself. Emily repeated the words back to him, her voice still quiet but vibrating with a hidden frequency of power. She asked him if that's what he thought was happening. Jason stepped even closer, his arrogance blinding him to the fact that he was now standing within the strike zone of two highly trained killers. He told her she was in over her head, that she was used to people tiptoeing around her because she was fragile, and that she didn't know how to handle the truth. Emily asked him softly if he wanted to talk about the truth. Jason, his face inches from hers, agreed. He told her the truth was that she didn't belong there, that the dog was the only reason anyone took her seriously. And then his hand came up. He reached for her shoulder, perhaps to push her, perhaps to grab her, or perhaps just to emphasize his point. The moment his fingers made contact with the fabric of her jacket, the world shifted. Ace moved like liquid lightning. One moment he was sitting, the next he was standing over Jason, his presence occupying the entire space between them before Jason's brain could even process the movement. Simultaneously, Emily's hand shot up, catching Jason's wrist in a grip that felt like a hydraulic vise. The cocky, sneering expression on Jason's face vanished, replaced instantly by a look of profound shock and rising pain. The entire bar went into a state of total sensory deprivation. No one moved, no one breathed. Emily said a single word, "Don't." Jason tried to pull his hand back. He jerked his arm, but Emily's grip didn't budge an inch. It was the kind of strength that didn't seem possible for her size, a mechanical, grounded power. His eyes went wide as genuine fear flickered across his face. Ace was pressed against his leg now, not biting, not even growling anymore, just existing as 100 pounds of controlled aggression waiting for a single syllable that would end the encounter. Jason managed to choke out a question, asking what the hell was happening. Emily told him the truth. She told him he didn't know her, didn't know what she did or where she had been. She pointed out that he had made assumptions based on his own insecurities, and that those assumptions told her everything she needed to know about him. Jason, his voice now closer to a plea than a command, told her to let go. Emily informed him she would let go when she was done. She reminded him that he had chosen to put his hands on her, and that now they were having a conversation of her choosing. Martinez was on his feet, his hands raised in a placating gesture. He tried to excuse Jason's behavior by saying he was drunk and didn't mean it. Emily didn't look away from Jason. She corrected Martinez, saying that Jason meant every word, he just wasn't used to the consequences of saying them. She applied a fraction more pressure to his wrist, and Jason let out a sharp gasp of pain. She told him that the dog he had insulted was certified in explosive detection, patrol, and protection, with 2 deployments and countless lives saved from wides. She told him that right now, the dog was deciding if Jason was a threat that needed to be neutralized. Jason stammered that he wasn't a threat. Emily pointed out that he had put his hands on the dog's handler, so in the dog's eyes, he absolutely was. She told him the only reason he was still standing was because she had told the dog to wait. She added with a chilling calmness that she didn't need the dog to protect her. Rather, Jason needed her to protect him from the dog. The silence in the bar was so heavy it felt physical. A phone buzzed on a nearby table, and the sound was as jarring as a gunshot. Emily's voice took on a sharper edge as she told Jason he was going to apologize. Not to her, but to the dog. She explained that the dog had shown him more restraint than he deserved. Jason, his voice shaking, called her insane. Emily told him to apologize or she would let go and they could see what happened next. The words tumbled out of Jason's mouth. He said he was sorry over and over, his face flushed with the deep, stinging heat of public humiliation. Emily held his gaze for 3 long, agonizing seconds before she finally released his wrist. Jason stumbled backward, cradling his hand, his body shaking with a mixture of fear and shame. Ace remained exactly where he was, a statue of dark fur and focused intent. Emily gave a quiet command for the dog to stand down. The transformation was instantaneous. Ace relaxed, his ears softening as he returned to her side and sat at attention. 1 second he was a weapon, the next he was a professional working animal, his tongue lolling slightly as he looked up at his handler. Emily scanned the bar, her eyes meeting those of the patrons who were still frozen in place. She asked if anyone else had questions about her dog. No one said a word. She pulled out her wallet, placed enough cash on the bar to cover her bill and a significant tip, and prepared to leave. Martinez suddenly spoke up, his voice cracking as he asked for her rank. Emily paused, looking back over her shoulder. She asked if it mattered. Martinez insisted that it did. She told him, Lieutenant Commander, Naval Special Warfare Command. The blood drained from Jason's face so quickly he actually swayed. Martinez's mouth dropped open. The bartender, a Navy veteran himself, straightened his posture instinctively. Someone in the back whispered a swear word in awe. Jason tried to speak, his alcohol-addled brain struggling to reconcile the woman in front of him with the image he had constructed. He stammered that she was so young, that she was a woman. Emily finished his thought for him, suggesting he should leave, sleep off the alcohol, and think about the choices that had led him to this moment. She told him to consider that the people he dismissed the most easily might be the ones he understood the least. As she walked toward the door with Ace at her heel in perfect precision, the crowd parted like water around a stone. No one was told to move, they just did. Jason called out to her, his voice desperate and devoid of his earlier bravado. He claimed he wouldn't have done it if he had known who she was. Emily stopped and turned fully to face him one last time. She told him that was the core of the problem. She explained that respect shouldn't be something people have to earn by proving their credentials. It should be the default until they prove they don't deserve it. She told him to think about why he felt entitled to treat a stranger that way and what that said about his character. Jason apologized again, and for the first time, he sounded like he actually meant it. Emily acknowledged the apology, and then she was gone. The heavy door swung shut, leaving the bar in a state of collective shock. Jason collapsed onto a stool, his head in his hands, muttering that he was screwed. Martinez agreed, his voice quiet and solemn. The bartender was already pulling up the security footage on a tablet, his face grim. He told Jason that Emily would likely have to file a report given her rank, and that the footage would confirm everything that had happened. Jason held onto a sliver of hope that she might just let it go. Martinez asked him if he would let it go if the roles were reversed. He reminded Jason that he hadn't just picked a fight with a random person. He had assaulted a senior officer. He warned him that he was looking at an Article 15 at the very least, possibly a court-martial. Jason's weak protest that he was drunk was dismissed by the bartender, who reminded him that he was still responsible for his actions. He added that Jason was lucky because he had seen what those dogs could do when they were given the green light. Jason's phone began to buzz incessantly. He pulled it out and watched as his social media began to explode. In the age of smartphones, someone had recorded the entire encounter. He watched a video of himself acting like a drunken bully, contrasting sharply with Emily's professional composure. The comments were already pouring in, some identifying her unit and record, others calling for him to be reported to his command. His phone rang with an unfamiliar number. When he answered, a crisp, official voice identified itself as Major Richards from the Marine Barracks in Washington. He was ordered to report to the Major's office at 8 the next morning. The Major noted that he had already seen the video and that the upcoming conversation would not be pleasant. The line went dead, leaving Jason sitting in the silence of his own making. The weight of his actions finally crashed down on him. It wasn't just the fear of punishment. It was the realization that the version of himself he had been projecting had been shattered by reality. He admitted to the bartender that he had thought she was weak, that the dog was a crutch. The bartender asked him what he thought now. Jason looked at the door Emily had exited and admitted that he realized he was the one representing everything wrong with the military, measuring people by assumptions instead of their actions. The bartender noted there might be hope for him yet, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Martinez finished his beer and left for the base, advising Jason to do the same and figure out what he was going to say the next morning. Jason asked how he could possibly explain himself. Martinez told him to tell the truth, that he was drunk, stupid, and completely wrong. He told him to own it and hope for mercy. The other Marines followed Martinez out, avoiding eye contact with Jason. Within 15 minutes, the bar was nearly empty. When the bartender offered him another beer, Jason declined, saying he'd had enough. He walked out into the cool night air, which cleared some of the fog from his mind but none of the shame. His phone continued to chime with notifications, a digital record of his mistakes spreading across the internet. He thought about Emily's restraint and discipline compared to his own lack of control. The walk back to the base felt like a funeral march. Each step was heavy with the knowledge that his life had changed forever. The gate guard nodded him through, but Jason could see the recognition in his eyes. News was already traveling. He made it back to his barracks, sat on his bunk in the dark, and listened to the silence. His wrist still ached where Emily had held it, a physical reminder of the power she possessed. He knew that the next day would likely bring the end of his career, but the truth he had to face about himself was even more daunting than any military tribunal. Back in the bar, the memory of the confrontation lingered. The way Emily's grip hadn't wavered as Ace held his position was a topic of hushed conversation among the remaining patrons. Jason's earlier attempt to pull away had been useless against the steel-like grip of the woman he had tried to intimidate. He had claimed his status as a Marine gave him some kind of immunity, a shield he could use to lash out at others. But Emily had dismantled that shield with a few quiet words and a display of absolute competence. When Jason's second hand had come up in a moment of reflexive rage, Emily hadn't panicked. She hadn't even looked surprised. She had intercepted his other wrist with the same mechanical precision, holding both of his arms as if they were made of glass. The command she gave to Ace, the single word "guard," had changed the frequency of the dog's growl into something that vibrated in the floorboards. It was a sound that signaled the end of the time for talking. Jason's eyes had widened as the alcohol haze was burned away by pure adrenaline. He had begged her to call off the dog, but Emily had corrected him. She told him Ace wasn't just a dog. He was her partner. She told him that Jason didn't get to decide the value of either of them. Martinez had tried to bridge the gap one last time, addressing Emily by her rank, which he had finally pieced together from the insignia and her demeanor. He pleaded for her not to let the situation escalate further. Emily's focus had briefly shifted to Martinez. She noted that he knew her rank. Martinez admitted he had figured it out from the way she carried herself and the specialized gear. He knew they were in the presence of someone who operated at a level far above their own. The realization that Jason had physically assaulted a lieutenant commander from Naval Special Warfare Command was sinking in, and it was a terrifying thought. The bar remained a vacuum of sound as Emily maintained her hold on Jason. It was a demonstration of total dominance that didn't require a single punch to be thrown. She was showing him, and everyone watching, what true strength looked like. It wasn't the loud, aggressive posturing Jason had displayed. It was the quiet, unshakable control of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of and didn't feel the need to prove it until it was absolutely necessary. As the moments stretched on, the physical pain in Jason's wrists began to take a backseat to the psychological toll of the encounter. He was being held like a child by someone he had tried to humiliate. He was being stared down by a dog that could end him in seconds. And he was being judged by an entire room of people who had seen his true colors. The bravado he had used as a weapon was now a weight around his neck. Emily finally released him, not because he had asked, but because she was finished with the lesson. She didn't stay to watch him crawl away. She didn't need to. She had asserted her authority, protected her partner, and maintained her dignity in the face of a direct assault. She left behind a man whose world had just been turned upside down, and a room full of people who would never forget what they had witnessed. The aftermath was a slow-motion car crash for Jason. The viral video was just the beginning. The military has a way of moving very quickly once the wheels of justice start turning, especially when the incident involves a senior officer and public disgrace. The phone call from Major Richards was just the first shot across the bow. Jason knew that by the time he stood in that office the next morning, every detail of his record would be under a microscope. Every mistake he had ever made, every instance of poor judgment would be brought to the surface. He thought about the participation trophy generation he had mocked. He realized that he was the one who had been expecting a trophy just for showing up and wearing the uniform. He had expected respect to be given to him because of his title, while he felt entitled to withhold it from others. Emily had shown him that respect is a two-way street, and that those who demand it the loudest often deserve it the least. As he sat in his dark room, the silence of the base felt oppressive. He could almost hear the whispers of the other Marines in the barracks. He knew the video was being shared in group chats and on private forums. His reputation, something he had spent years building, had been destroyed in a few minutes of drunken arrogance. He thought about Emily's final words to him, about why he felt entitled to treat a stranger the way he did. It was a question that didn't have an easy answer. It required him to look at the parts of himself he had been trying to ignore, the insecurity, the need for dominance, the fear that he wasn't as tough as he wanted people to think. In the end, the story wasn't just about a bar fight or a dog or a difference in rank. It was about the collision of two different worlds. One world was built on the outward show of strength, on noise and intimidation and the assumption of superiority. The other world was built on the quiet reality of competence, on discipline and restraint and the knowledge of one's own power. Jason had spent his life in the first world, and Emily had just given him a very painful introduction to the second. As the sun began to rise the next morning, Jason stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his uniform. He looked at the Marine Corps tattoo on his arm, the same one that had flexed as he grabbed Emily's shoulder. It didn't feel like a badge of honor anymore. It felt like a reminder of everything he had betrayed. He knew that the conversation with Major Richards would be the hardest of his life. He knew that he might be leaving the Marine Corps in disgrace. But as he walked toward the Major's office, he felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to pretend to be something he wasn't. He was just a man who had made a terrible mistake and was finally ready to face the truth. The gate to the administrative building loomed ahead. Jason took a deep breath, the cold morning air stinging his lungs. He thought of Emily and Ace, probably already miles away, back in their own world of high-stakes operations and silent professionalism. He hoped that one day he might understand the kind of strength she had shown. He hoped that he might earn back a fraction of the respect he had lost. But most of all, he hoped that the lesson he had learned in that dimly lit bar would stay with him, a constant reminder that the real warriors are often the ones you never see coming. He stepped inside the building, the sound of his boots echoing on the polished linoleum. He reported to the major's clerk, his voice steady for the first time in 12 hours. He was told to wait. As he sat on the hard wooden bench, he looked at the recruitment posters on the wall, the ones he had mocked Emily for appearing on. He saw the faces of men and women in uniform, all looking brave and determined. He realized then that he didn't know any of their stories. He didn't know what they had sacrificed or what they had seen. He had been judging the book by its cover, and he had been completely, utterly wrong. The door to Major Richard's office opened, and Jason stood up, ready to accept whatever came next. He was done with assumptions. It was time for the truth. The tension in the dimly lit bar was so thick it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on every patron who held their breath, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding near the edge of the pool tables. The neon signs for cheap beer flickered, casting rhythmic blue and red shadows across Emily's face, which remained as still as carved stone. Her hand was a vise around Jason's wrist, her grip not just strong, but precise, finding the exact pressure points that signaled total control. She didn't look like a woman in the middle of a bar fight. She looked like an apex predator who had calmly decided the hunt was over. Every movement she made was economical, stripped of unnecessary emotion, which only made her more terrifying to the man cowering beneath her gaze. "I should have stopped him earlier," the bartender muttered, his voice trembling as he looked at the wreckage of the evening. He wasn't just talking about the spilled drinks or the overturned chair. He was talking about the social order of his establishment that had been shattered in a matter of minutes. He looked at Jason, a man he likely saw every weekend, and then at Emily, a woman who had walked in as a ghost and was now the most dominant presence in the room. "That's on me," he continued, his thumb hovering over the screen of his smartphone. "But please look at him. He's got a wife, a kid on the way. He's up for promotion next month. He's just had too much to drink." Emily didn't blink. Her eyes stayed fixed on Jason, who was beginning to realize that his physical size meant nothing against the technique and lethal intent of the woman holding him. "He should have thought about all of that before he decided to put his hands on me," Emily said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried to every corner of the room, cutting through the low hum of the refrigerator units and the distant sound of traffic outside. She looked back at Jason, her expression flat, devoid of the anger he might have been able to understand. "Twice. He grabbed me twice. That isn't a lapse in judgment brought on by a few too many rounds. That's a pattern. That's a choice." Jason's face was a mottled mess of red and white, the bravado that had fueled his earlier insults evaporating like mist in the sun. "I didn't mean," he started to stammer, his voice cracking as he tried to find some purchase in the conversation. "Yes, you did," Emily interrupted, her voice dropping an octave, becoming something cold and dangerous. "You meant every second of it. You didn't just want to talk, you wanted to intimidate. You wanted to put me in my place because you didn't recognize the ground I stand on. You wanted everyone in this bar to see you dominate someone you perceived as weak, someone you thought you could break to make yourself feel larger." She applied just a fraction more pressure, a subtle shift of her weight that sent a fresh jolt of agony up Jason's arm. He let out a pathetic whimper, his knees buckling slightly. "How's that working out for you?" The bartender's phone was gripped tight in his hand. "Ma'am, I've got to call the MPs. This is base-adjacent property. I've got protocols I have to follow. If there's an assault on a service member or by one, I can't just let it slide." "Wait," Jason said, his voice rising in a desperate, high-pitched plea. "Please, just wait. I'll apologize. I'll do whatever you want. I'll leave, I'll pay for the drinks, I'll never come back. Just don't call the MPs, please, my career. I can't have this on my record." "Whatever I want," Emily repeated. Something dark and flickering moved in her eyes, a shadow of the person she had to be when she was downrange, in the places where mercy was a luxury no one could afford. "You think this is about what I want? You think I'm standing here deciding your fate like I'm on some kind of power trip? You think this is a game of ego for me?" She released one of his wrists with a suddenness that caught him off guard. Jason stumbled backward, his balance ruined, his boots scuffing loudly on the floor. Ace, the Belgian Malinois who had been a silent, statuesque guardian at her side, tracked every micro-movement. The dog didn't bark, he didn't need to. He simply shifted his weight, his muscles rippling beneath his tactical vest, his golden eyes locked onto Jason's throat. He didn't advance, but the promise of violence was written in the curve of his spine. "This stopped being about what I want the second you made it physical," Emily said, her hands now resting loosely at her sides, though her posture remained coiled. "The moment you touched me, you took it out of my hands and put it into the hands of the regulations you swore to uphold." Jason cradled his freed wrist against his chest, his face a mask of confusion and pain. He looked like a man who had suddenly woken up in the middle of a nightmare and couldn't find the exit. "I don't understand," he whispered. "If you're letting me go." "I'm not letting you go," Emily said firmly. "I'm giving you enough rope to hang yourself or save yourself. That is your choice now. The world is watching, Jason. Choose wisely." She turned her head slightly, nodding toward the man behind the bar. "Make the call?" "No," Jason lunged forward. It wasn't a calculated move. It was the raw, unthinking panic of a cornered animal. He didn't go for Emily this time. Perhaps some primal part of his brain had finally learned that lesson, but instead threw himself toward the bartender, reaching for the phone as if destroying the device could erase the consequences of his actions. He made it exactly 2 steps. Ace moved with a speed that defied human reaction. There was no growl, no warning snarl to telegraph his intent. There was only explosive, kinetic action. One moment the dog was sitting, and the next, he was a blur of tan and black fur, launching himself directly into Jason's path. He didn't bite, but he intercepted, his massive chest slamming into Jason's momentum, his jaws snapping open as he landed, teeth gleaming like polished ivory under the harsh bar lights. Jason froze mid-step, his forward momentum carrying him so close that he could feel the hot, rhythmic huff of Ace's breath against his leg. The dog was a statue of controlled aggression, his teeth inches from Jason's thigh, his eyes unblinking. "Oh God," Jason whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Oh God, please." "Ace, hold," Emily commanded. The dog instantly went rigid, every line of his body screaming a desire to finish the fight, yet held in check by a level of discipline that few humans could ever hope to achieve. He stayed there, a living barrier between the aggressor and the witness. "You don't charge at people when you're already in deep trouble," Jason, Emily said, her voice dripping with a weary kind of disappointment. "That's basic survival instinct. Even as drunk as you are, you should know better than to escalate a situation with a working dog in the room." "I wasn't charging," Jason lied, his voice breaking into a sob. I was trying to stop him from calling. I can't let him call." "By doing what?" Emily asked, stepping closer until she was within the dog's perimeter. "Grabbing the phone, intimidating a civilian, using your physical presence to prevent a citizen from following legal protocol." She shook her head slowly, the movement full of a cold, analytical pity. "Every choice you make tonight is digging you deeper into a hole you won't be able to climb out of. Every single one." The bartender didn't wait for any further drama. He had the phone to his ear, his voice low and hurried as he spoke to the dispatcher. His eyes never left the dog or the woman who controlled him. Jason heard the words through the haze of his own panic. "Assault military personnel, I need the MPs here immediately." The words hit Jason like a physical blow, more effective than any punch Emily could have thrown. He felt his world tilting sideways, the floor seemingly falling away beneath his boots. "My career's over," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Oh God, my career is over. Everything I worked for." "Maybe," Emily said. Her voice lacked any trace of sympathy. It was the cold assessment of an officer looking at a failed piece of equipment. "It depends on a lot of factors. It depends on your command's response, whether I decide to press formal charges, and whether the video evidence supports a claim of self-defense or excessive force." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment before dropping the final hammer. "And yes, there is video, multiple angles. I'm sure the bartender has a security system, and I counted at least 3 people with their phones out. And then, of course, there's Ace's collar cam." Jason's head snapped up, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "The dog has a camera?" "Naval Special Warfare K9s are equipped with high-definition body cams as standard protocol," Emily explained. "Everything Ace sees, everything he hears, it's all recorded and uploaded to a secure server, which means your entire performance tonight. Every word you spit at me, every moment you thought you were teaching a lesson to someone who didn't belong, every time you put your hands on me, it's all documented. It's captured from a perspective that doesn't lie." The implications of her words seemed to drain the last bit of life from Jason's face. The ambiguity he might have hoped to hide behind, the he said, she said of a dark bar, was gone. That means there's zero doubt about who the aggressor was. Emily finished for him. That means when this goes to your command, and it will, they won't be looking at a report of a misunderstanding. They'll be watching a first-person movie of a corporal assaulting a superior officer. Jason's legs finally gave out. He didn't fall to the floor, but he collapsed backward onto a nearby bar stool, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders began to shake, the sound of his ragged breathing the only noise in the sudden stillness. "I'm so screwed," he muttered into his palms. "I'm so completely screwed." Martinez, who had been watching the entire scene from the sidelines with a mixture of horror and helplessness, finally stepped forward. He put a tentative hand on Jason's shoulder, his own face grim and ashen. "Yeah, man," he said softly. "You really are." The heavy front door of the bar swung open, letting in a gust of cool night air and the rhythmic strobing of red and blue lights from the parking lot. Two MPs stepped into the room, their uniforms crisp, their expressions professionally neutral. They moved with the practiced ease of people who had responded to 1,000 bar calls, their eyes scanning the room and immediately identifying the points of friction. The senior officer, a staff sergeant with touches of gray at his temples and a chest full of ribbons, spoke first. "We got a call about an assault in progress. Who's the complainant?" Emily didn't hesitate. She raised her hand slightly, a small, authoritative gesture. "Lieutenant Commander Emily Stark, Naval Special Warfare Command." "This man," she said, nodding toward the broken figure of Jason on the stool, "physically assaulted me twice. There are multiple witnesses, and as I told him, multiple video angles, including the body cam footage from my working dog." The staff sergeant's eyes flickered to Ace. He took in the specialized harness, the alert, professional bearing of the dog, and the way the animal sat perfectly still despite the new arrivals. His expression shifted instantly from routine neutrality to sharp, focused interest. "Naval Special Warfare," he repeated, his voice taking on a new level of respect. "And you are?" He directed the question at Jason. "Corporal Jason White, United States Marine Corps," Jason said miserably, his head still hanging low. He couldn't even bring himself to look the MP in the eye. "Corporal," the staff sergeant said, and his tone had gone from professional to icy. "Did you put your hands on a superior officer?" "I didn't know she was." Jason started, his voice trailing off as he realized how pathetic the excuse sounded. "That's not what I asked," the staff sergeant interrupted, his voice like a whip. "I asked if you put your hands on her." "Yes or no?" Jason's shoulders slumped further, if that was even possible. "Yes. Twice." "Yes." The staff sergeant exchanged a look with his partner, a younger corporal who looked like he was trying very hard to keep his jaw from dropping. The gravity of the situation was clear to everyone wearing a uniform. This wasn't just a bar fight, this was a career-ending catastrophe. "Ma'am, we're going to need a full statement," the sergeant said, turning back to Emily. "Corporal White, you're coming with us. You have the right to remain silent." "Wait," Emily said suddenly. The staff sergeant paused, his hand already reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. "Ma'am, before you read him his rights and take him out of here, I want to ask him something." The sergeant hesitated. He looked at the paperwork he would eventually have to fill out, then at the rank on Emily's shoulder. "Ma'am, that's not really standard protocol once we've arrived on scene." "I know exactly what the protocol is, Sergeant," Emily said quietly, but with an authority that brooked no argument. "I'm asking for a moment, just one question." The staff sergeant looked at his partner, then back at Emily. He nodded slowly, stepping back but keeping a wary eye on Jason. "One question, ma'am." Emily turned to Jason. She studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment, watching the way he avoided her gaze. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and what she saw there wasn't the arrogant, entitled drunk from 20 minutes ago. It was a man who had just watched his entire life collapse in real time and was still trying to figure out how the world had turned upside down so quickly. "Why?" Emily asked simply. The question was devoid of anger, filled instead with a genuine, piercing curiosity. "Why me? Why tonight? What did I do or what did I represent that made you so incredibly angry?" Jason opened his mouth to speak, closed it, and then opened it again. He looked around the bar at the witnesses, at his friend Martinez, and then back at the dog. "I don't know," he finally admitted, and for the first time that night he sounded like he was telling the absolute truth. "I saw you sitting there and I don't know, you looked like you didn't belong. Like you were taking up space that should have been mine." "Space in a bar?" Emily asked. "Space in the military," Jason said, the words tumbling out now. "You're young, you're a woman, you've got this high rank, and I'm out there busting my ass every single day just to make corporal." Just to get noticed, just to feel like I matter in the grand scheme of things. And you're sitting there looking like it all came easy, like you didn't have to fight for it. I guess I just wanted to prove something. Prove what? That I mattered more than you, Jason said, his voice cracking on the last word. That my service meant more, that I earned my place and you just got handed yours because of some quota. He laughed, a bitter, jagged sound that had no humor in it. Pretty stupid, huh? Pretty stupid, Emily agreed, her voice softening just a fraction. But you know what you actually proved instead? Jason shook his head, a single tear escaping and tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. You proved that rank and respect have absolutely nothing to do with how loud you can yell or how aggressive you can be, Emily said. You proved that the people who have truly earned their place in this world don't feel the need to tear others down to justify their existence. And most importantly, you proved that your insecurities are your problem, not mine. I didn't take anything from you, Jason. You threw it away all by yourself. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the MPs seemed frozen, watching the exchange unfold like it was something outside their usual script of arrests and paperwork. The other patrons had moved closer, drawn in by the raw honesty of the moment. "I'm sorry," Jason said finally. He didn't look away this time, and he sounded like he meant it. Not because he had been caught, not because his career was in shambles, but because he finally saw the person standing in front of him instead of the caricature he had created in his mind. "I was wrong. About you. About what strength looks like. About everything." Emily studied him for another long moment, her analytical mind weighing the sincerity in his voice against the gravity of his actions. She nodded slowly, then turned to the staff sergeant. "Sergeant, can I have a word with you privately?" The sergeant looked surprised, but he gestured toward a quieter corner of the bar, away from the prying ears of the crowd. "Sure, ma'am." They stepped away, speaking in low, urgent tones. Jason watched them, his face a mixture of flickers of hope and deep resignation. He looked like a man watching a jury deliberate on his life. Martinez stood beside him, his hand still on Jason's shoulder, a silent anchor in the middle of a storm. The conversation lasted barely 2 minutes, but to Jason it must have felt like an eternity. He watched the staff sergeant's expression go from professional skepticism to deep contemplation, and finally to something that looked suspiciously like respect. The sergeant glanced at Jason once, his face unreadable, then nodded to Emily. They returned to the group. The staff sergeant looked at Jason, his face hardening back into its official mask. "Lieutenant Commander Stark has agreed not to press formal charges tonight, under certain very specific conditions. You're going to hear those conditions now, and you're going to decide right here and right now whether you accept them or whether we proceed with the arrest and the full legal weight of an assault on a superior officer. Are we clear?" Jason nodded frantically, his voice coming out in a rush. "Yes. Yes, whatever she wants. I'll do anything." "First condition," Emily said, her voice regained its command. "You enter an alcohol treatment program immediately, not the base's mandatory one-day class where you sit in the back and sleep. A real, intensive program, 90 days minimum. You attend every session, you do the work, and you provide proof of completion to your command and to me." "I will," Jason said, not even hesitating. "Second condition," Emily continued. "You write a formal letter of apology, not to me. I don't need your words, you write it to your command. You explain exactly what you did, why you did it, and what you're going to do to ensure that you never represent the Marine Corps in this manner again. And you will copy me on that correspondence." "Done," Jason whispered. "Third condition," Emily said, and her voice went hard, the edge of a blade returning to her tone. "You never, ever use your rank, your service, or that uniform as a reason to intimidate or belittle another human being again. You don't get to hide behind your Marine Corps tattoo while acting like everything the Corps stands against. You want respect. You earn it every single day through your actions, not through your assumptions of superiority." Jason nodded, tears running freely down his face now, all the bravado stripped away to leave only the man underneath. "I understand. I truly do." Fourth condition, Emily said, pausing for effect. 1 year from today, you are going to stand in front of a room of junior Marines. You are going to tell them this story, every embarrassing, pathetic detail. You'll tell them what you did, what happened, what it almost cost you, and you're going to use your own failure to teach them what a real leader looks like. You will turn your mistake into a shield for someone else. Jason's face went pale. The idea of standing before his peers and subordinates to admit such a shameful lapse was clearly terrifying. "That is non-negotiable," Emily interrupted before he could speak. "You want to keep your career. You want a chance to fix the damage you've done? Then you own it. Publicly, you take the weight of your choices and you use them for something good. The staff sergeant was watching Emily with something approaching awe. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 15 years and I've never seen anyone handle a situation like this. You're letting him off easy." Someone called out from the back of the bar, a voice emboldened by the resolution of the tension. Emily's head turned, her eyes finding the speaker with a precision that silenced the room. "Am I?" she asked. "He's going to wake up tomorrow knowing that his career, his reputation, and his entire future are held in the balance of my discretion. He's going to spend the next year proving to himself and to his command that he deserves the mercy I'm showing him tonight. He's going to have to relive this night every time he looks in the mirror and every time he stands in front of those junior Marines. He's going to carry the knowledge that a woman he tried to diminish showed him more honor and restraint than he could ever muster for himself." She looked back at Jason, her gaze piercing. "Sound easy to you, Corporal?" Jason shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "No, ma'am. It sounds like exactly what I deserve. It's more than you deserve," Emily corrected him. "But it's what you're getting, because I'm not in the business of destroying careers over drunken stupidity if there's a chance for rehabilitation. I'm in the business of making sure the people in uniform around me are better tomorrow than they were today." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "You've got potential, Jason. Don't waste the one chance you have to prove it." The staff sergeant pulled out a notepad, his pen scratching across the paper. "We're still documenting this, ma'am. Even without the formal charges, this goes into the incident report. His command will be notified of the encounter and the agreement." "Good," Emily said. "They should be. Transparency is the only way this works." She looked at Jason one last time. "You've got one chance. Don't make me regret giving it to you." "I won't," Jason said fervently. "I swear on my life I won't." Emily nodded, then turned her attention to the dog who had been the silent enforcer of her will. "Ace, release." The dog immediately relaxed, the terrifying tension flowing out of his body as he sat at attention by her side, his tail giving a single, sharp thump against the floor. Emily reached down, her hand stroking the soft fur behind his ears, murmuring something too quiet for the others to hear. Ace looked up at her, his tongue lolling out, looking like a different animal entirely than the one that had almost taken a piece out of Jason seconds before. "Ma'am?" Martinez spoke up as Emily began to turn toward the door. "Can I ask you something?" Emily stopped. "Go ahead." "Why?" Martinez asked, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Why give him another chance after everything he said to you? You could have buried him tonight. You could have ended it all right here. Why didn't you?" Emily was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the door, then back to the young Marine. "Because about 7 years ago, I was a junior officer who made a really stupid mistake. It wasn't like this," she added quickly, her voice firm. "It wasn't an assault. But it was stupid, it was career-threatening, and it was born out of my own arrogance. And someone, a mentor I respected, showed me a mercy I didn't deserve. They gave me a chance to prove I was better than my worst moment." She looked at Jason, who was listening intently. "I spent years trying to live up to that mercy. I worked twice as hard, studied twice as long, and held myself to a standard that was probably impossible, all because I didn't want to prove that person's faith in me was misplaced. Somewhere along the way, I realized that's how you build better people. Not by crushing them the moment they fail, but by giving them the weight of your expectations and seeing if they have the strength to carry them." "What if he doesn't?" the bartender asked quietly from behind the counter. "What if he screws up again next week? Then I'll be the first one calling for his court-martial," Emily said simply. "This is a one-time offer. Second chances are precious gifts. Third chances don't exist in my world." Jason nodded, a new kind of understanding passing across his face. He wasn't just afraid anymore, he was focused. "I won't need a third chance," he said. "I promise." "Promises are the easy part," Emily said, her hand resting on Ace's harness. "Actions are what matter. Show me." The MPs finished their documentation, collecting contact information from the bartender and the witnesses who had recorded the event. The bar began to breathe again, the heavy atmosphere slowly dissipating as conversations resumed in hushed, urgent tones. People were already showing each other the videos on their screens, processing the strange blend of justice and mercy they had just witnessed. Emily headed for the door, Ace at her heel, moving with the synchronized grace of a single unit. This time, nobody called her back. No one tried to stop her. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, a path of silence following her as she stepped out into the cool night air of the parking lot. She had made it 3 steps toward her car when she heard footsteps behind her. Martinez was jogging to catch up, his breath visible in the chilly air. "Commander Stark," he called out. "Wait." Emily turned, her expression patient but tired. "Yes, Martinez? I need to apologize, too," he said, stopping a few feet away. "I saw what was building. I knew Jason was getting worked up. I knew he was drinking too fast, and I didn't stop him. I should have cut him off, gotten him out of there, or just told him to shut his mouth. Instead, I just sat there and let it happen because I didn't want to be the guy who couldn't take a joke." "You did try to stop him," Emily pointed out. "I saw you pull at his arm. I heard you tell him to sit down." "It wasn't hard enough," Martinez insisted, his voice full of self-reproach. "Not early enough. I was worried about embarrassing him in front of the guys. All the wrong priorities." Emily studied him for a second, the orange glow of the parking lot lights reflecting in her eyes. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you just learned a lesson that takes some people 20 years to figure out," Emily said. "And I think the next time you're in a situation like that, you'll make a different choice. You'll realize that being a friend doesn't mean being an enabler. That's growth, Martinez. That's what actually matters." Martinez nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "He's lucky it was you he grabbed, someone else. They might have reacted differently. They might have let the dog do what he's trained to do." "Ace is trained to protect me," Emily said, looking down at the Malinois who was sitting calmly, watching the perimeter of the parking lot. "But he's also trained to show restraint, to respond proportionally, to use the minimum force necessary to achieve the objective." She smiled, a small, genuine thing that finally reached her eyes. "He's actually better at that than most people I know." "Can I ask you one more thing?" Martinez said, his curiosity getting the better of him. "You're full of questions tonight, aren't you?" "Sorry, ma'am, it's just... How did you stay so calm? If someone grabbed me like that, I don't know if I could have kept my temper. I would have wanted to swing back." Emily's smile faded, replaced by a look of profound weariness. "You think I was calm?" Martinez blinked. "You seemed like you were made of ice." "I seemed calm because I've spent 15 years training my body and my mind to look that way," Emily said. Inside, I was furious. I was absolutely livid that I couldn't even sit and have a quiet evening without being harassed. But anger makes you stupid. And in my line of work, stupid gets people killed. So I learned a long time ago to take that anger, box it up, and save it." She paused, looking out toward the dark horizon. "It'll still be there tomorrow, but I'll use it productively on a heavy bag or a long run instead of letting it destroy a situation I needed to control." That's impressive," Martinez said. "That's survival," Emily corrected him. "In the teams, losing control means you've already lost the mission. You learn control or you wash out. There is no middle ground." Martinez nodded, processing the weight of her words. "Thank you for not destroying him, ma'am. Thank you for trying to stop him," Emily countered. "Even if it wasn't enough this time, you tried. That counts for something." She turned and walked to her car, a nondescript sedan that blended into the shadows. Ace jumped into the backseat with practiced ease, settling onto his blanket and immediately entering a state of relaxed vigilance. Emily slid behind the wheel and started the engine, but she didn't put it in gear right away. She sat there in the dark, her hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2. The facade of the unshakable commander cracked just a little. Her hands were shaking, a fine, rhythmic tremor that she couldn't suppress. Her breathing was shallow and fast, the adrenaline she had bottled up finally demanding its due. She closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against the cool leather of the wheel. "You okay, buddy?" she murmured, her voice a little rough. In the rearview mirror, she saw Ace's ears perk up. He made a soft, questioning sound, a low rumble in his chest that wasn't a growl or a whine. "Yeah," Emily whispered, "I'm okay, just..." Processing, that could have gone a lot worse. For everyone. Ace's tail gave a single, heavy thump against the seat, his way of acknowledging her voice. Emily took a long, deep breath, holding it until her lungs burned, then letting it out in a slow, controlled hiss. She reached for her phone, her thumb hovering over her commander's name. He needed to hear this from her, not from an MP report or a viral video. She hit the call button. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert despite the hour. "Stark, is everything okay?" "Sir, I need to brief you on an incident," Emily said. Her voice was back to its professional cadence, the tremor in her hands subsiding as the mission mindset took over. "I was involved in an altercation at a bar tonight. No injuries to report, MPs were called, and the situation is documented. But you're going to get a report, and I wanted you to have the context from me first." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Are you all right, Emily?" "I'm fine, sir. Ace performed perfectly. But there's going to be some attention." I saw at least 3 people filming, and given the current climate, it's going to be on social media before the sun comes up. I wanted to get ahead of the narrative. Give me the details, her commander said, his tone shifting into briefing mode. Emily ran through the encounter with clinical precision. She didn't exaggerate Jason's aggression or downplay her own response. She described the assault, the intervention of the dog, and the conditions she had set in lieu of pressing formal charges. Her commander listened in silence, only interrupting to ask a few clarifying questions about the legalities of the agreement. You gave him conditions instead of a court-martial, he asked when she finished. Yes, sir. That's generous of you, Stark. Some would say too generous. I view it as strategic, sir, Emily replied. Formal charges would have led to a media circus. A Marine assaulting a Naval Special Warfare officer makes for a very ugly headline. This way we handle the discipline internally, the individual receives necessary treatment and rehabilitation, and we avoid a PR nightmare that serves no one. Plus, I think the corporal actually learned something tonight. Her commander chuckled, a dry, gravelly sound. Strategic, huh? Nothing to do with that soft heart you try to hide under all that tactical gear. Those factors may have played a minor role, Emily admitted, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. But the strategy remains sound. It does, he agreed. I'll expect your full written report on my desk by 0900. And Stark, well done. Textbook de-escalation. You did the Navy proud tonight. Thank you, sir. She ended the call and let the phone drop into the passenger seat. She finally allowed herself to slump back, the exhaustion of the day and the intensity of the night catching up to her. Ace leaned forward, resting his chin on the center console, and Emily reached back to scratch the sweet spot behind his ears. Good boy, she whispered. Such a good boy. Ready to go home and get some real sleep? Ace's tail wagged, a rhythmic thumping that filled the quiet cabin of the car. Emily put the sedan in gear and began the slow drive out of the parking lot. She passed the MPs, who were still loading a subdued Jason into the back of their patrol car. As her headlights swept over them, she saw Jason look up. For a split second, their eyes met through the glass. There was no anger left in him, only a profound, heavy realization of how close he had come to the edge. Emily drove away, leaving the neon lights of the bar behind. She navigated the quiet, tree-lined streets toward her small house near the coast, the rhythm of the road helping to settle the last of the adrenaline. Tomorrow would be a day of paperwork, of answering for her decisions, and of dealing with the inevitable fallout of the digital age. But as she pulled into her driveway and saw the familiar silhouette of her home, she knew she had made the right call. It wasn't the easy path, and it certainly wasn't the one that offered the most immediate satisfaction, but it was the one that aligned with the person she had fought so hard to become. She stepped out of the car, Ace following close at her side. The world was quiet now, the only sound the distant crash of the surf against the shore. She took one last look at her phone as she walked toward her front door. The screen was a chaotic mess of notifications. The video was already out. She could see a thumbnail of herself, looking calm and lethal, and Ace, looking like a guardian from a myth. Perfect, she sighed, the blue light of the screen illuminating her tired face. This is going to be a long week. Ace whined softly, nudging her hand with his nose. Not you, buddy, she said, leaning down to kiss the top of his head. You were the only perfect thing about tonight. This is just the world being the world. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the click of the lock signaling the end of the night's mission. But as she sat on her sofa in the dark, the phone in her hand began to vibrate again. It wasn't just a few notifications anymore, it was a flood. Her name was trending. People were debating the ethics of her mercy, the speed of her dog, and the mystery of her identity. She stared at the screen like it was a live grenade, the pin already pulled. She started to scroll, and the sheer volume of the response made her stomach drop. Half the comments were calling her a hero, a model of modern leadership and restraint. The other half were calling for the Marine's head on a platter, or accusing her of being too soft, of undermining the very discipline she claimed to uphold. Emily closed her eyes, the glow of the phone still burning through her eyelids. She had wanted to teach one man a lesson in the darkness of a bar. Instead, she had accidentally invited the entire world to the lecture. And as the notifications continued to pour in, she realized that the quiet night she had hoped for was still a long, long way off. The blue light of the smartphone screen cast a ghostly, flickering pallor over the interior of the car, illuminating the sharp lines of Emily's face as she scrolled. Outside, the night was a quiet shroud, the parking lot nearly empty, but within the palm of her hand, A digital storm was raging with a ferocity that seemed detached from reality. The video had only been live for a few hours, but it had already taken on a life of its own, a viral beast that was currently tearing its way through every social media platform in existence. Emily watched the play count tick upward in real time, a dizzying blur of numbers that represented millions of strangers peering into a moment of her life she wished had never happened. The comments were a battlefield. On one side, a vocal contingent hailed her as a modern hero, a paragon of military restraint who had handled a volatile situation with the grace of a seasoned diplomat. They praised her for not escalating, for keeping her cool when a man twice her size had invaded her space. But the other side was a dark, toxic mirror. There, she was dismissed as a diversity hire who had simply gotten lucky, or worse, a vindictive female officer using her rank to systematically dismantle a man's career for a momentary lapse in judgment. The middle ground, where reason and nuance usually lived, was a ghost town, completely drowned out by the extremes screaming at each other across the digital void. Emily leaned her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes, the silence of the car a sharp contrast to the noise in her head. This was exactly why she harbored a deep-seated loathing for social media. In that space, context was a casualty, and complexity was the enemy of engagement. Nobody cared about the years of training that had led to that moment, or the split-second calculations she had made to avoid a bloodbath. They only cared about the outrage. They cared about the side they had chosen to defend. Ace, sensing the shift in her mood, shifted his weight on the passenger seat. He leaned over, resting his heavy, warm head on her shoulder, his breathing a steady, rhythmic pulse against the side of her neck. He was the only thing that felt real in that moment, the solid, grounding presence of a partner who didn't care about viral videos or public opinion. He just knew that his person was stressed, and he was there to shoulder the burden with her. Her phone began to vibrate again, the vibration rattling against the plastic of the center console. She didn't even have to look at the screen to know who it was. The caller ID confirmed her suspicion. Dad. She stared at the name for a long beat, considering letting it go to voicemail. She knew that avoiding him would only delay the inevitable and likely make the eventual conversation 10 times more explosive. Taking a steadying breath, she hit accept. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice sounding tired even to her own ears. Emily rose stark. What the hell did I just watch? The voice of Admiral Richard Stark came through the speaker with enough localized force to make her physically wince. Even though he had been retired for years, the man still possessed a command presence that could peel paint off a bulkhead from 1,000 miles away. It wasn't just the volume. It was the sheer, unyielding weight of his authority, a tone forged in decades of naval tradition and high-stakes decision-making. "You saw the video," Emily said, a statement rather than a question. "Everyone saw the video, Emily. Your mother's bridge club saw the video. My golf buddies are texting me links. The guy who does our taxes called 10 minutes ago just to make sure you were okay." He paused, and for the first time, the Admiral's bark softened into the concerned rasp of a father. "Are you okay, kid? Really?" Emily felt a lump form in her throat when she quickly swallowed back down. "I'm fine, Dad. Ace is fine. Everything is handled. I'm sitting in the car trying to process how the world got so loud so fast." "Handled," her father repeated, the Admiral returning to the forefront. "You call going viral and having half the internet dissecting your every move, every blink, and every word handled. You're trending on Twitter, Emily. People are calling for that Marine's head on a pike and others are calling for yours." "I call not getting court-martialed handled," Emily shot back, her own defensive edge sharpening. "I call not having to send a young corporal to the brig for 10 years because I lost my temper handled. What did you want me to do, Dad? Let him hit me? Or should I have let Ace rip his throat out? I had a drunk, angry man in my face, and I chose the path that resulted in the fewest number of bodies on the floor. I chose the path that kept the uniform out of the mud as much as possible." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Emily could almost picture her father in his study, his jaw working as he chewed through his initial, visceral reaction to get to the logic beneath. It was a trait she had inherited from him, this pathological need to process and analyze before speaking, and she knew it was something that had driven her mother to the brink of insanity over the years. "You showed restraint," he finally said, his voice quiet. "Extremely impressive restraint, probably more than he deserved if I'm being honest." "Probably," Emily agreed. "Your mother thinks you should have pressed every charge in the book. She's already looking up the maximum sentencing for assault on a superior officer. You know how she gets. Emily couldn't help but let out a small, tired laugh. Mom thinks anyone who even looks at the uniform the wrong way should be keel-hauled. She also thinks Ace should be given a field promotion and his own command. Her father chuckled, a dry, warm sound. She's not wrong about the second part. That dog has better judgment than half the officers I served with during my time at sea. But seriously, Emily, seeing someone put their hands on my daughter like that, it made me want to drive down there myself and teach that Marine some manners that the Corps clearly missed. The raw protective instinct in his voice made Emily's chest ache. I'm okay, Dad, truly. It wasn't the first time someone underestimated me, and it certainly won't be the last. I've dealt with worse in the field. That doesn't make it okay, he grumbled. No, Emily agreed softly, looking out at the dark horizon of the parking lot. It doesn't make it okay, but it's the reality we live in. I had two choices tonight. I could let the situation break me and the career of a young man who was too drunk to know better, or I could use it as a moment of accountability. I chose the latter. You sound like your grandfather, her father said, and there was a note of profound pride in his voice that caught her off guard. Her grandfather had been Navy through and through, Vietnam veteran, a man of few words and many scars. He had passed when she was 15, but she still remembered the way he'd looked at her when she first told him she wanted to commission. It was a look of deep concern masked by even deeper respect. I'll take that as a compliment, Emily said. It was meant as one. Now listen. Your CO called me earlier. He wanted to give me a heads up about the incident report you're filing. He said you handled the paperwork and the scene by the book. Emily felt a flash of irritation. He called you? Dad, I'm not a midshipman. I'm a lieutenant commander. I don't need my CO calling my father every time there's a localized incident. He didn't call me as your father, Emily, her father said, his tone turning professional. He called me as a former admiral who still carries a fair amount of weight in certain circles. He wanted my read on the optics. He wanted to know how the fallout might affect the Navy's image and how to spin it if the media pressure gets worse. He was looking for strategic advice. And what did you tell him? I told him my daughter doesn't need spinning. I told him she handled a volatile, potentially career-ending situation with professional poise and the kind of restraint that should be taught at the academy. And I told him that if anyone at Big Navy has a problem with how you handled yourself, they can bring it to my front door. He paused, his voice dropping an octave. I also told him that if that Marine ever touches you again, retirement be damned, I will make sure he regrets every decision he's ever made, starting with the day he walked into a recruiter's office. Emily smiled, leaning her head against the window. Thanks, Dad. That actually means a lot. That's what fathers are for, even when their daughters are decorated naval officers who clearly don't need the help. Get some rest, kid. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. The news cycle is just getting started. That's a terrifying thought, Emily muttered. They said their goodbyes, and Emily sat in the car for several more minutes, the silence returning but feeling less oppressive than before. Her phone was still humming with notifications, text messages from friends, emails from colleagues, and alerts from news sites. She finally reached over and flipped the switch to silent, the sudden absence of noise a blessing. She grabbed her bag from the floor, unbuckled Ace, and headed inside. The house was dark and cool, a sanctuary of quiet that she desperately needed. She went through the motions of her nightly routine with a sense of detachment. She fed Ace, watching the way he sat patiently by his bowl, ever the professional even at home. Then she stepped into the shower, letting the hot water scald away the lingering smell of the bar, the scent of cheap beer, and the electric metallic tang of adrenaline that had been clinging to her skin. By the time she climbed out, she felt human again, though her bones felt as if they were made of lead. She was halfway to her bedroom when the phone on the nightstand lit up. A different number this time, an official-looking area code. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the device before she picked it up. Lieutenant Commander Stark speaking. Commander, this is Captain Morrison, JAG. I apologize for the late hour, but your incident report just crossed my desk, and I felt this couldn't wait until morning. Emily's stomach did a slow, heavy roll. A call from the Judge Advocate General's office at this hour was never a social visit. It meant lawyers. It meant legal scrutiny. It meant the situation was shifting from a personal incident into a bureaucratic nightmare. Yes, sir. I assume you've seen the footage. I've seen every angle of it, Commander, including the footage from your K9's body cam. It's quite a piece of digital evidence. Morrison paused, and Emily could hear the rustle of papers on his end. In 20 years of doing this job, I've seen 1,000 bar fights. I've seen hundreds of assault cases and dozens of incidents where military personnel forgot their training and their dignity in a moment of anger. But I have never, not once, seen someone with your level of legal justification for pressing charges choose to walk away. Emily sat down on the edge of her bed, her damp hair dripping onto her shoulders. Sir, I felt the situation was better handled through a path of restorative accountability. Corporal White was out of line, but he was also intoxicated and influenced by a very specific set of bad assumptions. I'm not criticizing your character, Stark, Morrison interrupted, his voice surprisingly gentle. I'm impressed, and if I'm being honest, I'm confused. Help me understand the tactical reason for this, because right now I'm trying to decide if you're incredibly wise or if you just made my job exponentially more difficult. Sir, if I press charges, what is the outcome? Emily asked, her voice steady. He gets a court-martial. He gets a dishonorable discharge. He becomes a felon. The media turns it into a circus, protests on both sides, my face on every news channel for a month while talking heads debate whether I was a victim or a villain. It becomes a story about military dysfunction. It would be messy, yes, Morrison conceded. And my way, the way I proposed to him, it's unorthodox, I know. It puts a lot of faith in a man who hasn't given me much reason to trust him. But if it works, it turns the story into one of accountability and second chances. It makes him responsible for his own redemption. It keeps the Navy and the Marine Corps out of a public legal battle. That's a big if, Commander, Morrison said. What happens if he doesn't follow through? What happens if 3 months from now he's drunk at another bar, starting another fight? What happens if your mercy is interpreted as weakness, not just by him, but by every other Marine who sees that video? Then I'll be the first one to sign the paperwork for his court-martial, Emily said firmly. And I'll do it with a clear conscience, knowing I gave him every possible chance to save himself. My documentation is thorough, sir. I'm not letting him off the hook. I'm giving him the rope to either climb out of the hole or hang himself with it. The choice is entirely his. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. You've got steel in your spine, Commander. Your father would be proud. He actually called me about an hour ago, you know. He told me your mother wanted to see the Marine keel hauled. Emily couldn't help but smile. She's always been the more bloodthirsty one in the family. I served with both of them back in the day, Morrison said, his tone shifting back to the pragmatic. I'm going to support your decision, Stark. The conditions you've set are legally enforceable and, frankly, quite brilliant in their simplicity. I'll draft the official agreement and have it sent to Corporal White's commanding officer by tomorrow morning. He signs it and commits to the terms, or we proceed with the formal charges. It's his move. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. This could still blow up in our faces. The public doesn't always appreciate nuance. One more thing, the video is everywhere. You're going to get requests for interviews. Media outlets are going to offer you a platform to tell your story. My advice, don't engage. Let the Public Affairs Office handle the press. Stay above the fray. Let your actions speak for themselves. That was already the plan, sir. I have no interest in being a celebrity. Good. Get some sleep, Commander. Tomorrow, the real work begins. He hung up, and Emily finally allowed herself to fall back onto the pillows. Ace jumped up onto the bed, circling twice before settling into a large, warm ball of fur at her feet. She lay there in the dark, the quiet of the house finally beginning to seep into her bones. One drunk Marine, one bad night, and suddenly the entire trajectory of her week had been rewritten. Her phone buzzed one last time. It was a text from an unknown number. She almost deleted it without looking, but the first few words caught her eye. Commander Stark, this is Jason White. I know I have no right to contact you, but I needed to say this where there's no audience and no MPs. I'm sorry, not because I got caught, but because I was wrong. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I understand what you did for me tonight. I won't waste it. I swear on everything I am, I won't waste it. Emily stared at the words for a long time. They felt raw, stripped of the bravado and anger she had seen in the bar. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to maintain the professional distance that her rank required. But another part of her, the part that believed in the very accountability she had preached, felt the need to acknowledge it. She typed back a short, 4-word response. Actions, not words, show me. She hit send and turned the phone off completely. The next morning came far too early. The sunlight streaming through the blinds felt aggressive, and Emily's neck was stiff from the awkward position she'd fallen asleep in. She was halfway through her first cup of coffee when the phone rang. It was her executive officer, Commander Chen. "Stark," she answered, her voice still gravelly with sleep. "Boss, we've got a situation," Chen said, his voice tight with a tension that instantly cleared the fog from her mind. "You need to get to the base, now." "What kind of situation?" Emily asked, already moving toward her closet to pull out her uniform. "The kind where admirals are using words like scandal and inappropriate use of force. Someone is pushing back on your decision not to press charges, and they are pushing hard." "Who?" "Would you believe Corporal White's company commander, Captain Reynolds? He's arguing that by not pressing charges, you made the entire incident look less serious than it was. He's claiming you undermined military discipline and made the Marine Corps look weak." Emily stopped mid-motion, a cold, hard knot of anger forming in her chest. "He's arguing that I should have destroyed one of his own men? That's his angle. He's arguing that assault on a superior officer demands maximum punishment, regardless of the circumstances. He's saying that by mercy policing, you've set a precedent that will lead to more insubordination. And Emily, he's got some people listening to him." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Emily said, her jaw set. "Chen, get me everything you can on Reynolds. Service record, disciplinary history, any complaints filed against him by his subordinates. If he wants to talk about military discipline, I want to know exactly what his version of it looks like." "Already on it, boss. This is going to get ugly." "It was always going to be ugly," Emily said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "We just chose our brand of ugly. Now we defend it." The drive to the base felt like a countdown. As she pulled through the main gates, Emily could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Usually, she was just another officer in a sea of uniforms, but today, she was the center of the gravity well. She felt the eyes following her as she parked, the hushed whispers that cut off the moment she stepped out of the vehicle with Ace at her side. The video had permeated every corner of the command, and every sailor and Marine on base now had a stake in the outcome. Chen met her in the hallway, his face a grim mask of professional concern. "Reynolds is in the main conference room. He's in there with Admiral Kincaid and Captain Morrison. They're waiting for your statement." "Kincaid?" Emily's eyebrows rose. Admiral Kincaid was the embodiment of the old Navy, a man who viewed the modern integration of women in combat roles as a failed social experiment and who valued rigid, punitive discipline above all else. This wasn't just a meeting, it was an ambush. "Yeah," Chen whispered. "Be careful in there, Emily. Reynolds is playing this like you disrespected his Marine by not taking the assault seriously enough. It's twisted, but it's landing with Kincaid." Emily straightened her tunic, checked that Ace's harness was perfectly aligned, and took a deep breath. She didn't look like a victim, and she didn't look like a celebrity. She looked like an officer of the United States Navy who was about to go to war. She pushed open the heavy oak doors of the conference room and stepped inside. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment the door clicked shut behind her. The three men were seated around a massive table, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and unyielding tension. "Lieutenant Commander Stark," Admiral Kincaid said, his voice a neutral drone that didn't quite hide the coldness in his eyes. "Thank you for joining us." "Sir." Emily stood at stiff attention, Ace sitting perfectly still at her heel, his eyes fixed on the men across the table. "We've been discussing the incident from 2 nights ago," Kincaid continued, leaning back in his chair. "Captain Reynolds here has some significant concerns about the way you chose to handle the aftermath." Reynolds stood up immediately, his face a flushed shade of red that clashed with his desert camis. He was a barrel-chested man with a posture that suggested he was perpetually ready to headbutt a wall. "With all due respect, Commander, you made my Marine look like a victim. You gave him a list of conditions instead of the consequences he earned. You treated a felony assault on a superior officer like it was a teaching moment from a HR seminar. I treated it like an opportunity to correct behavior rather than end a career," Emily said, her voice calm and level, a sharp contrast to Reynolds' burgeoning heat. "Corporal White made a grave mistake, but it was a mistake born of intoxication and bad information. It was correctable." "Assault isn't a mistake," Reynolds barked, slamming a hand onto the table. "It's a crime. It's a violation of every core value we instill in our Marines. By not prosecuting him to the fullest extent of the law, you sent a message to every junior enlisted man on this base that the rules are flexible. You sent a message that women officers will just let things slide if they are asked nicely." Emily felt a surge of cold fury, but she didn't let it touch her face. I sent a message that leadership can be restorative. I sent a message that we can hold our people accountable without destroying their entire lives over one night of stupidity. That isn't weakness, Captain, that's judgment. That's not military justice, Reynolds sneered. That's social work. It's leadership, Emily countered, her voice hardening. And the last time I checked the manual, that was still the primary function of our rank. Admiral Kincaid held up a hand, a small movement that instantly silenced the room. Gentlemen, Commander, let's maintain a level of professional decorum. Commander Stark, I've reviewed the evidence. I've watched the video and I've read your report. What I'm struggling with, and what the captain here is emphasizing, is why you, as the victim of this assault, are the one arguing for leniency. Because I am not a victim, Admiral, Emily said, her eyes locking onto his. I am an officer who successfully de-escalated a situation that could have ended in a hospital visit or a funeral. I used my training, my judgment, and my authority to achieve the best possible outcome for the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the individual involved. Best possible outcome? Reynolds scoffed, shaking his head. He put his hands on you. And I stopped him, Emily said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous tone that made Reynolds blink. I stopped him without using excessive force. I stopped him without allowing the situation to spiral into a media-fueled race riot or a PR nightmare for the Department of Defense. I handled it. The real question here, Captain, is why you are so deeply invested in making sure I didn't. The silence that followed was deafening. Reynolds' face shifted from red to a deep, bruised purple. Excuse me. You heard me, Emily said, stepping forward, her presence filling the room. You're in here arguing that I should have court-martialed one of your own Marines. You're arguing that I should have ended the career of a man you are responsible for training and leading. Why? What do you gain from his destruction? Does it make you feel more powerful? Does it make your command look stronger to have one more man in the brig? I gain respect for the uniform, Reynolds snapped. I gain deterrence. I gain the knowledge that my Marines know there is a line they do not cross. Your Marines? Emily repeated slowly, a small, cold smile touching her lips. That's interesting, Captain, because I took the liberty of looking into your company's disciplinary records this morning. Tell me, how many alcohol-related incidents has your command had in the last 12 months? Reynolds stiffened, his eyes darting toward the Admiral. I don't see how that's relevant to this discussion. Answer the question, Captain, Kincaid said, his voice quiet but absolute. Reynolds' jaw worked. 7 incidents, Emily repeated. And how many of those resulted in a full court-martial? How many of those men were dishonorably discharged? That's different, Reynolds sputtered. Those were internal matters, Marines against Marines, not an assault on a superior officer from another branch. So the problem isn't the behavior, Emily said, her voice cutting through his excuses like a blade. The problem is who the behavior was directed at. You don't care about the sanctity of the uniform, Captain. You care about the fact that I handled one of your men better than you've been handling your entire company. You're embarrassed that a Navy diversity hire showed more leadership in 5 minutes than you've shown in a year. Reynolds looked as if he were about to explode, but Kincaid's voice cracked like a whip before he could speak. Sit down, Captain. Reynolds sank into his chair, the shock of the Admiral's tone silencing him. Kincaid turned his gaze back to Emily, his expression unreadable, his fingers drumming a slow, rhythmic beat on the tabletop. Continue, Commander, Kincaid said. Emily took a breath, organizing her thoughts with clinical precision. Sir, I made a judgment call. I saw a young man who was lost, drunk, and operating on a set of toxic assumptions that he likely learned from the culture of his command. But I also saw real remorse. I saw a man who, when confronted with the reality of what he'd done, was horrified. I could have ended him. It would have been the easiest thing in the world. But what would that have proven? That the Navy is bigger than a corporal. We already know that. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. If we destroy every person who makes a mistake, we'll eventually have no one left to lead. We have to be strong enough to show mercy. We have to be confident enough in our authority that we don't feel the need to crush everyone who challenges it. If Corporal White can be rehabilitated, if he can become a better Marine because of this, isn't that a greater victory for the service than a discharge? Captain Morrison, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. For what it's worth, Admiral, Commander Stark's approach is legally sound. The agreement I've drafted is ironclad. If White slips up once, if he misses a single counseling session or fails a single breathalyzer, we move straight to a court-martial. She hasn't tied our hands. She's given us a roadmap for a better outcome." Kincaid leaned forward, his eyes searching Emily's face for any sign of hesitation. "Captain Reynolds, do you have anything else to add to this record?" Reynolds looked like he was chewing on broken glass. "Just that I think this sets a dangerous precedent, sir." "Noted," Kincaid said. He turned back to Emily. "Commander Stark, I'm going to allow your approach to stand, but let me be very clear, the weight of this decision rests on your shoulders. You will personally monitor Corporal White's compliance. You will provide monthly reports to Captain Morrison and to my office. If he fails, it's on you. If this blows up in the press as the Navy being soft, it's on you. Are we clear?" "Crystal, sir," Emily said, her heart hammering against her ribs, though her voice remained steady. "And Commander," Kincaid's voice softened just a fraction, a rare moment of humanity breaking through the icy exterior. "For what it's worth, you showed exceptional judgment. The kind of judgment I wish more of my officers possessed. Don't let men like Captain Reynolds make you doubt that." Dismissed. Emily snapped a perfect salute, turned on her heel, and walked out of the room. It wasn't until she was halfway down the corridor, safely out of sight, that her legs finally began to shake. The adrenaline that had been sustaining her for the last hour began to ebb, leaving her feeling hollow and exhausted. Chen was waiting for her near the exit, his face anxious. "Well, we won," Emily said, leaning against the cool cinder-block wall for a moment. "But I'm officially Corporal White's babysitter for the foreseeable future. I have to monitor his every move." "Could be worse," Chen said, a small grin touching his lips. "You could be looking for a new job." "True," Emily sighed, pushing off the wall. "Chen, I need you to get me White's full schedule. Every training rotation, every duty station, every PT session. If I'm responsible for him, I want to know where he is every minute of every day. I'm not giving Reynolds a single opening to sabotage this." "You're actually going to mentor him," Chen said, his tone one of genuine surprise. "I'm going to make sure he doesn't waste the chance I gave him," Emily corrected. "There's a difference. Now let's get back to work. I have about 50 emails I've been ignoring." The rest of the day was a blur of administrative tasks and meetings, but the atmosphere on the base had shifted. The whispers hadn't stopped, but the tone had changed from skepticism to a wary kind of respect. Emily kept her head down, focusing on the work, refusing to let the digital world intrude on her professional space. Late that afternoon, she found herself back at her desk, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon outside her window. She opened her personal email for the first time all day, bracing herself for more vitriol. But the first message at the top of her inbox was from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line was simply, "Thank you." She clicked it open. "Commander Stark, you don't know me, but I was at the bar the night of the incident. I saw everything. I'm an Army veteran, and I've been struggling with PTSD and significant anger issues since I got back from my last deployment. I've spent a lot of time feeling like the world is just waiting for me to fail. Watching you the other night, seeing how you handled that Marine with so much control and wisdom, it gave me something I haven't had in a long time. It gave me hope. If you can show that kind of restraint under that kind of pressure, maybe I can learn to do it too. Thank you for being an example of what we should all aspire to be. Respectfully, Sergeant Mike Patterson." Emily read the email 3 times, her eyes stinging. In all the noise of the viral video, the legal threats, and the bureaucratic infighting, she had forgotten that there were real people watching, people for whom that moment meant more than just a headline. She sat back and took a breath, the weight on her chest finally beginning to lift. She pulled up a new message and began to type. "Sergeant Patterson, thank you for your service and for your incredibly kind words. Control is a skill, not a gift. It can be learned and it can be mastered even in the darkest moments. If you are struggling, please know that you aren't alone. There are resources available and there are people who want to help you find your way back. You are stronger than you think. Respectfully, Lieutenant Commander Emily Stark." She hit send and sat there for a long moment, watching the cursor blink on the screen. Maybe the last 48 hours hadn't been a disaster after all. Maybe, in the middle of all the chaos, something good had actually happened. 3 days later, the initial frenzy of the viral video had begun to subside, replaced by the next cycle of internet outrage. Emily was in the middle of a routine training brief for her team, the familiar rhythm of the military day providing a sense of much-needed normalcy. Ace was curled up in his usual spot under the table, the picture of contentment. Suddenly, the phone in her pocket began to vibrate with the sharp, staccato rhythm of an emergency alert. She ignored it at first, but it happened again and then a third time. She glanced down at the screen and felt her stomach drop into her shoes. It was a series of messages from Captain Reynolds. "Commander Stark, we have a problem. An emergency situation involving Corporal White. Contact me immediately." Emily excused herself from the room, her heart already beginning to race as she stepped into the quiet hallway and hit the dial button. "Reynolds, what happened?" she demanded the moment the line connected. "Commander," Reynolds' voice was tight, stripped of its usual bravado and replaced by something far more unsettling. "You need to get down to the motor pool. Now. We have a situation with White, and it's about to get very public." The voice on the other end of the line was clipped, professional, and sharpened with a precision that Emily had come to associate with military bureaucracy at its most rigid. But underneath that veneer of duty, she could hear it. A low, vibrating note of satisfaction that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Captain Reynolds wasn't just delivering news. He was delivering a verdict he had been waiting to hand down since the moment Emily had stepped onto his base. "Corporal White failed his drug test this morning," Reynolds said. The words didn't just register in Emily's mind. They hit her like a physical blow to the chest. For a split second, the air in the hallway seemed to vanish, leaving her lungs straining against a sudden, icy vacuum. Emily's blood went cold, the warmth draining from her face as she gripped the phone tight enough to make the plastic casing groan. She managed a single, breathless word. "What?" "Your analysis came back positive for cocaine," Reynolds continued, his tone gaining a conversational lightness that felt entirely predatory. "He's in custody right now pending investigation." The sound of a pen scratching against paper echoed through the line, a mundane sound that underscored the finality of what he was saying. Reynolds paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to ensure Emily felt the full weight of the failure he was attributing to her. "I believe this validates my concerns about your leniency, Commander. The Marine you vouched for, the one you insisted deserved a second chance, is a drug user." "That's impossible," Emily said, her voice finally finding its footing, though her mind was racing at a frantic pace. She pictured Jason White's face, the raw desperation in his eyes, the way he had looked at his daughter's photograph. He agreed to the terms. He knew he was being monitored. He was under a microscope, and he knew it. Why would he throw everything away now? It makes no sense. "Because that's what failures do," Reynolds interrupted, his voice snapping back to a harsh, commanding bark. "They fail. It's in their nature. They take the hand you offer them and they bite it because they don't know any other way to live. I'm recommending immediate court-martial proceedings. This goes beyond the simple assault now. This is a direct violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice on multiple fronts. Possession, use, and the utter disregard for the conditions of his temporary release." Emily's grip tightened on her phone until her knuckles turned a stark, bone white. She could feel the walls of the hallway closing in, the institutional gray of the paint suddenly feeling like a cage. "I need to see the test results," she demanded, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "I want the lab reports, the chain of custody documentation, the collection logs. I want everything." "You don't have jurisdiction here," Commander Reynolds shot back, the satisfaction in his voice replaced by a sharp, territorial edge. "He's a Marine. This is our problem now. He's my responsibility, and I will see to it that this is handled according to the standards of the Corps." "You said so yourself 3 days ago," Emily countered, her words cutting through his bluster like a scalpel. "You told me I was responsible for monitoring his compliance. That means I get access to anything and everything that affects his status. If he's failed a test, I am the first person who should have been notified, and I am the first person who gets to review the evidence. Don't play gatekeeper with me, Captain." Reynolds was silent for a beat, the sound of his heavy breathing the only thing filling the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold, stripped of its earlier smugness. "Fine. I'll send you the documentation. But Commander, make no mistake, this is over. Your little experiment in social work has failed. That Marine's career is done, and frankly, after this, your judgment is now in question, too. You've let your personal feelings cloud your professional duty, and the Corps doesn't forget that kind of mistake." He hung up before she could respond, the dial tone a sharp, mocking buzz in her ear. Emily stood in the hallway for a long moment, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She tried to make sense of the information, to find the logic in a man like Jason White, a man who was fighting for his life and his family, deciding to use cocaine in the middle of a high-profile legal battle. Jason White was many things. He was impulsive. He was a heavy drinker. He was, in many ways, his own worst enemy. But he didn't strike her as a drug user. He was drunk and stupid, yes, but cocaine. Something felt fundamentally, dangerously wrong. Her phone buzzed again in her hand, the vibration making her jump. It was a text message from an unknown number. She tapped the screen, her breath catching as the words appeared. "Commander, please, I didn't do this. I swear on my daughter I didn't do this. They're setting me up. Please believe me." It was signed Jason White. Emily stared at the message, the glowing screen illuminating the dark hallway. Every instinct she had developed over years of service and investigation was screaming that the narrative being fed to her was a lie. She pulled up her contacts, scrolling rapidly until she found Chen's number. She didn't wait for a greeting when he picked up. "Boss, drop everything. I need you to look into something for me," she said, her voice urgent. "Corporal Jason White just failed a drug test. I need to know every single detail. Who administered the test? Who handled the sample? Who had access to the secure locker between the time of collection and the time it was transported to the lab? I want a timeline, and I want it 10 minutes ago." "You think it's bogus?" Chen's voice sharpened with immediate interest, the sound of keyboard clicking already audible in the background. "I think it's convenient," Emily said carefully, her eyes narrowing as she began walking toward her office. "Too convenient. 3 days after I put my reputation on the line for him, 3 days after I stood in front of a room of officers and vouched for his character, he suddenly tests positive for a drug he's never had a history with. Right when Captain Reynolds is looking for a reason to prove me wrong and bury this kid." She pushed open her office door, the familiar scent of old paper and stale coffee greeting her. "Check everything, Chen. I want timestamps, signatures, video footage if it exists. I want the names of every person who stepped into that collection facility. Someone is playing games with a man's life to make a point, and I want to know who held the cards." "On it, boss," Chen replied, his tone grim. "If you're right about this. If someone messed with a federal drug test." "If I'm right," Emily finished, her voice cold and hard as granite, "someone just committed a federal crime to win a bureaucratic argument. And that someone is going to regret the day they thought they could use my investigation as a pawn." She sat at her desk, her movements mechanical and precise, and pulled up the documentation Reynolds had sent. The files appeared on her screen in a series of stark, black and white PDFs. The test results were clear and damning. Cocaine metabolites were present in Jason's system at levels consistent with use within the last 72 hours. On paper, it was an open and shut case. The paperwork looked legitimate. The chain of custody was documented. Everything was strictly by the book. Except, Emily leaned closer to her screen, her eyes scanning the fine print of the collection log. She studied the signatures, the loops and slants of the handwriting. The sample had been collected at 0600, which was the standard procedure for the unit's random screenings. But as she traced the timeline, she saw a gap. The sample had sat in the unit's secure locker for 4 hours before being picked up for transport to the laboratory. 4 hours where the sample was essentially stationary. According to the access log for that secure locker, only 2 people had opened it during that window. One was the unit's drug testing coordinator, Staff Sergeant Mills. The other was Captain Reynolds himself. Emily's phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the silence of the office. She saw the caller ID and straightened her posture. It was Morrison from JAG. "Commander, I just got a very interesting and very heated call from Captain Reynolds," Morrison said without preamble. His voice sounded weary, the tone of a man who had been dealing with high-level headaches all day. "He seems to think your project has imploded." He was quite colorful about it. "My project," Emily repeated flatly, her eyes still fixed on the names on her screen. "His words, not mine," Morrison said. "He's pushing for immediate prosecution. He wants White brought up on charges for both the original assault and the positive drug test. He's arguing that we need to move fast before this becomes a bigger embarrassment for the command and the Navy. He's already talking to the press office about a statement on maintaining standards." "Captain Morrison, I need 24 hours, Emily said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. "For what? To watch the wreckage? To prove that test is fraudulent?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, the silence on the line heavy with the realization of what she was suggesting. "That's a serious accusation, Emily. You're talking about a criminal conspiracy within a command structure. I know exactly what I'm talking about, but something is wrong here. The timing is too perfect. Reynolds has been looking for a way to undermine my decision since the first day I arrived. Now, suddenly, his Marine, the one he wants gone, tests positive right when it would prove him right and make me look like an amateur. It's too clean. It's too surgical. Emily pulled up the chain of custody form again, highlighting the names. The sample sat in a locker for 4 hours with only 2 people having access. One of them is the man who wants White gone more than anyone else on this base. You're saying a Marine captain tampered with evidence to frame one of his own men. Morrison's voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away, but Emily could hear the gears turning. He was a lawyer. He knew that if this was true, it would be a scandal that would rock the entire installation. I'm saying I need 24 hours to investigate before we destroy a man's life based on a test that is suspiciously convenient for his commanding officer, Emily said. Sir, if I'm wrong, I'll personally recommend the maximum punishment for White. I'll write the brief myself. But if I'm right and we don't check, we're letting a criminal in a uniform get away with evidence tampering. We're letting the system be used as a weapon against the very people it's supposed to protect. 12 hours, Morrison said, his voice coming through with a new, sharp finality. That's all I can give you. Reynolds is already drafting the charges, and he has the ear of the general. If you don't have solid, undeniable evidence of tampering by 1800 tomorrow, we proceed with the prosecution. Are we clear, Commander? Crystal, sir. Thank you. Emily hung up and immediately called Chen back. She didn't have time for a preamble. I've got 12 hours to prove tampering. Where are we on the footage? I pulled the security feed from the drug testing facility, Chen said. His voice hummed with a quiet intensity. You're going to want to see this. I'm sending a secure link to your workstation now. Get ready to lose your appetite. 20 minutes later, Emily was in Chen's cramped, screen-filled office, the air humming with the sound of cooling fans and server racks. They were watching a grainy, high-angle security camera feed. The timestamp in the corner showed 06:30, exactly 30 minutes after Jason's sample had been collected and logged. The secure locker, a heavy steel box bolted to the floor, was clearly visible in the frame. For 2 minutes, the hallway was empty, the flickering fluorescent lights creating a stuttering effect on the video. Then the door at the end of the hall opened. Captain Reynolds walked into the frame. He didn't look like a man on a mission. He looked casual, almost bored. He paused, looking around to make sure the corridor was empty, his eyes lingering on the camera for a second before he turned his back. He pulled out his access card and swiped it. He's opening the locker, Chen said quietly, his finger hovering over the playback controls. Emily watched as the heavy door of the locker swung open. Reynolds stood in front of the secure container, his broad shoulders blocking the view of what his hands were doing. He remained there for perhaps 45 seconds, not long, but long enough for someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. He didn't look at any other samples. He didn't perform an inventory. He just stood there. Then he closed the locker, checked the hallway again, and walked away. The whole interaction took less than 2 minutes. That's not proof, Emily said, her voice tight with frustration. We can't see what he's actually doing. He's the commanding officer. He has access. He could say he was checking the inventory, verifying the security of the lock, or just doing a spot check. It's suspicious, but it's not a smoking gun. Keep watching, Chen said. He hit the fast-forward button. The timestamp jumped ahead to 0700. The door opened again, and this time it was Staff Sergeant Mills. She entered the room with a clipboard in hand, her movements brisk and practiced. She opened the locker with her own card and began the official inventory check required before the samples were packed for transport. She pulled out the plastic vials one by one, checking the labels against her list. When she got to a specific vial, the one Emily knew must have been Jason's, she paused. She didn't just check the label, she held it up to the light. She turned it over in her hands, her brow furrowing. She checked her paperwork, then looked back at the vial, her confusion evident even through the grainy footage. She set the vial aside on a separate table and pulled out her phone. She noticed something, Emily said, leaning forward until her nose was inches from the screen. Look at her face. She's not just confused, she's concerned. Yeah, and watch what happens next, Chen whispered. 5 minutes later, as Mills was still staring at the vial, the door opened again. Captain Reynolds walked back in. The interaction was brief. Mills showed him the vial, pointing to something on the cap or the seal. They had a short conversation. Emily wished for audio, but the silence only added to the tension. Reynolds took the sample from her hands, examined it himself for a few seconds, then spoke to her. His body language was dominant, leaning into her space. Mills looked uncertain, her head tilting as if she were questioning him, but ultimately she nodded. The sample went into the transport container with all the others. Reynolds patted her on the shoulder in a way that looked patronizingly reassuring and left. What did she notice? Emily wondered aloud, her mind turning over the possibilities. If he spiked the sample, he had to open it. If he opened it, he had to break the seal. I called her, Chen said, turning his chair to face Emily. She wouldn't talk on the phone. She sounded like she was looking over her shoulder the whole time, but she agreed to meet with you. She said it was important, but she was very clear it had to be off base and in civilian clothes. Emily checked her watch. The 12-hour clock was already ticking down. Where and when? A coffee shop off base in 30 minutes. She's terrified, Emily. You need to be careful how you handle this. Emily was already standing, her mind already 3 steps ahead. Perfect. Get me everything else you can find while I'm gone. Phone records, duty logs, anything that shows Reynolds' movements that morning. And Chen pulled Jason White's entire record. I don't just want his disciplinary file. I want medical, dental, previous drug tests, performance reviews from his last 3 commands. If Reynolds planted this, there has to be a reason beyond just proving me wrong. He's a captain. He knows the risk. He wouldn't do this just for a petty win. There's a deeper motivation here. 35 minutes later, Emily walked into a small, nondescript coffee shop 3 miles from the base. Ace was at her side, his service vest removed to make him look less like a military animal, though he still moved with a disciplined grace. Both Emily and the dog were in civilian clothes, jeans and a simple jacket. Staff Sergeant Mills was already there, tucked into a corner booth in the far back of the shop. She was huddled over a coffee cup, her hands wrapped around it as if the warmth were the only thing keeping her from shaking apart. She looked up as Emily approached, her eyes darting to the door and then back to Emily, filled with a raw, naked fear. Emily slid into the seat across from her, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. "Thank you for meeting me, Staff Sergeant. I know how much you're risking by being here." Mills didn't answer immediately. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving Emily's. "I could get in serious trouble for this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the espresso machine. "If the captain finds out I'm talking to you, you'll be in more trouble if you don't tell me what you know and it comes out later during a federal inquiry," Emily said gently, but with an underlying firmness. "I've seen the security footage. I saw you find something wrong with Corporal White's sample. I saw the captain come in and take it from you. What did you notice, Mills?" Mills bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the table. She looked like she wanted to run, but she stayed. "The seal was wrong," she said finally. Emily's pulse quickened. "Wrong how? Every sample gets sealed with a tamper-evident strip," Mills explained, her voice gaining a bit of professional steadiness as she moved into familiar territory. "It's a specific type of adhesive, applied in a specific way. It's part of the strict protocol to ensure the chain of custody isn't compromised. If that seal is broken or even slightly misaligned, the sample is considered contaminated." Mills pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she tapped through her photo gallery. She turned the screen toward Emily. "I took a photo of it this morning. I didn't know why I was doing it, just an instinct." Emily looked at the image. It was a close-up of a plastic vial. The blue tamper-evident strip was there, but as she looked closer, she saw what Mills had seen. The edge of the strip was slightly jagged, and it was applied a fraction of a millimeter off-center. To an untrained eye, it looked fine. To someone who processed thousands of these, it was a glaring red flag. White's sample had the right strip, Mills said, but it was applied like someone had removed it and tried to put it back. It wasn't the factory clean seal it should have been. "Did you document this?" Emily asked. "I tried to," Mills said, a flash of resentment flickering in her eyes. "I started to fill out a chain of custody discrepancy form. That's the procedure. You stop the line, you flag the sample, you investigate. But Captain Reynolds came in before I could finish. He took the form from me. He said I was being paranoid, that I was looking for problems where there weren't any. He told me that if I filed a discrepancy, it would hold up the entire batch, cause a massive administrative headache for the whole unit, and reflect poorly on my performance. He threatened your career," Emily stated. "He said it would show a lack of judgment," Mills corrected, her voice trembling again. "He said he'd already checked the locker himself and that everything was fine. He told me to just pack it up and send it out. He made it sound like I was the one being difficult. But you took the photo anyway." "I take photos of everything," Mills admitted. "It's how I protect myself. In this man's military, if something goes wrong, they always look for the lowest-ranking person to blame. I wanted documentation that I had noticed a problem, even if I was told to ignore it." She looked at Emily with eyes that were suddenly wet with tears. "Commander, if that sample was tampered with, if Captain Reynolds actually put something in there, I don't want to be the person who enabled it." I joined the Corps to do things the right way. But he's a captain. If I accuse him of evidence tampering and I can't prove it, he'll destroy me. He'll make sure I never get promoted or worse. Emily pulled out her own phone and showed Mills a still frame from the security footage, the exact moment Reynolds had taken the vial from her. Is this the moment you're talking about? Mills studied the image and nodded. Yes. That's when I showed him the seal. That's when he told me I was wrong. She paused, a look of realization dawning on her face. But he was lying. He had to be. I've processed thousands of these. I know what a proper seal looks like. That one was wrong because someone had opened it. Would you be willing to testify to that? Emily asked. Mills went pale, the color draining from her lips. Testify, like in a court. Like in a formal federal investigation, Emily clarified. Staff Sergeant, if I'm right, this isn't just about Corporal White. It's about the integrity of your entire drug testing program. It's about every Marine who has ever walked through that door. If a commanding officer can tamper with evidence to frame a subordinate, then the entire system is a lie. Every result that comes through your facility is suspect if there are no consequences for this. Mills closed her eyes and took a long, shaky breath. He's going to destroy me, she whispered. He's going to try, Emily said, her voice filled with a fierce conviction. But I won't let him. You have the photo. You have the security footage showing you trying to report it. You followed protocol, and he was the one who shut you down. You did your job, he's the one who failed his. Will that even matter? Mills asked. At the end of the day, he's an officer. I'm just a staff sergeant. Who's going to take my word over his? I will, Emily said firmly. And so will JAG when they see your photo compared to the security footage and when they see the independent lab results that I'm about to order. The evidence doesn't care about rank. The truth doesn't have a pay grade. Mills stared into her coffee for what felt like an eternity. The sounds of the shop, the clinking of spoons, the hiss of steam, the muffled conversations of other patrons seemed to fade into the background. If I do this, she said finally, looking up at Emily, I need protection. I don't mean physical protection. I need career protection. I need it in writing that I'm cooperating with an official investigation and that any retaliation against me will be treated as a criminal offense. Done, Emily said. I'll have Captain Morrison at JAG draw up the paperwork within the hour. You'll be listed as a material witness in a federal investigation. That comes with specific high-level protections that even a captain can't touch. Mills nodded slowly, her shoulders dropping as if a massive weight had been partially lifted. Okay, I'll do it. But Commander, you better be right about this, because if you're wrong, if there's some other explanation, we're both finished. I'm right, Emily said with a confidence she had to force into her voice. Trust me. She left the coffee shop and walked back to her car, her mind already moving to the next phase of the operation. She called Morrison before she even started the engine, filling him in on everything Mills had said. She sent him the photo of the tampered seal as she spoke. Morrison was silent for several seconds after she finished. This is bad, he finally said, his voice grave. If Reynolds did this, if a Marine captain actually tampered with drug test evidence to frame a subordinate just to win a procedural argument, the fallout is going to be catastrophic. This won't just stay on this base. This is the kind of thing that goes all the way to the Pentagon, which is why we need to be absolutely certain before we move, Emily said. We can't rely on the original test. If Reynolds spiked the sample, the lab did their job correctly. They found what was there. We need the original sample tested again, but we need it done independently, with a full recorded chain of custody that Reynolds can't touch. Morrison's voice shifted into a sharp planning mode. The lab is required to keep original samples for 30 days. I'll send independent investigators to secure it immediately. I want full documentation, video recording of the chain of custody from the moment they take possession. We'll run an expedited panel. How long? Emily asked. 4 hours for a rush. We'll have the results by 2200 tonight. Emily checked her watch. It was 1400. 8 hours. 8 hours until she either saved a man's life or watched her own career go up in flames. Keep me posted, she said, and hung up. She drove back to the base, the landscape of Southern California blurred in her periphery. Her mind was churning through the implications. The central question kept bothering her. Why? Why would Reynolds take such a massive, career-ending risk? It wasn't just about being right. He was a seasoned officer. He knew how to play the long game. There had to be something else. She pulled into her parking spot and sat there with the engine off, the silence of the car filled only by Ace's soft breathing. She began to think about the patterns. Reynolds had 7 alcohol-related incidents in his company in the last year. That was a high number, high enough to be a black mark on any commander's record. It suggested a lack of discipline, a poor command climate. It suggested that Reynolds was losing control of his men. But what if those incidents weren't just alcohol? She pulled out her phone and called Chen. I need a deep dive into those previous 6 alcohol incidents in Reynolds' company. Names, dates, circumstances, and especially the outcomes. I'm looking for a pattern, Chen. By 1800, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, orange shadows across Emily's office. Chen walked in, carrying a thick folder of printed documents. You were right to look, he said, dropping the folder on her desk. Reynolds has a problem, but it's not just alcohol. It's perception. Explain, Emily said, opening the folder. Of his last 7 alcohol-related incidents, 4 resulted in quick courts-martial. But the other 3, they were handled administratively. They were buried. When you look at those 3 specific cases, they all share something in common. They were incidents where Reynolds could have been blamed for the command climate. One happened during an unauthorized party in the barracks. Another was a recurring issue with a sergeant who Reynolds had promoted despite previous warnings. If those had gone to trial, people would have started asking questions about Reynolds' leadership. So he made them go away quietly, Emily noted. Exactly, but Jason White's case was different. It went viral. There were millions of eyes on that video. Reynolds couldn't bury it, and he couldn't handle it administratively without looking weak. So he tried to change the narrative. If he could show that White wasn't just a drunk Marine, but a drug user, it shifted the blame. It wasn't a failure of Reynolds' command climate anymore. It was a failure of the screening process. It turned White into a bad apple that had slipped through the cracks, rather than a product of a broken unit. He was protecting himself by destroying a man who was already down, Emily said, a cold fury beginning to boil in her chest. He used the drug test as a shield for his own career. At 21:45, the phone rang. It was Morrison. We have the results, he said. Emily stood up, her hand gripping the edge of her desk. And the original sample, the one secured from the lab, was tested independently. It came back clean, completely clean. No cocaine, no metabolites, nothing. Morrison's voice was tight with a controlled, professional anger. Someone added cocaine to that vial after it was collected, but before it was processed. And based on Staff Sergeant Mills' testimony and the security footage, the timeline only points to one person. Reynolds, Emily said. Reynolds, Morrison confirmed. I've already briefed the general. NCIS is moving in now. This is no longer an administrative matter. It's a federal criminal case. Evidence tampering, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Emily felt a sudden, dizzying sense of vindication, followed immediately by a wave of exhaustion. What about White? All charges related to the drug test are being dropped immediately. He's being fully exonerated of that charge. As for the original assault, we're keeping him in the diversion program you set up, but under a different command. He's being transferred out of Reynolds' unit tonight. Morrison paused. Commander, you were right to push back. If you hadn't, we would have sent an innocent man to prison. When does White get told? Right now. I'm calling the brig now. He'll be released within the hour. Emily hung up and sat back in her chair. Ace rested his heavy head on her lap, sensing her shift in mood. She'd been right, but the victory felt heavy. A Marine captain, someone who was supposed to be a leader, a mentor, had been willing to destroy a subordinate's life just to save his own reputation. It was a betrayal of everything the uniform stood for. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Jason White. They just told me. I don't have words, Commander. You believed me when you had every reason not to. You saved my life. Thank you doesn't even begin to cover it. Emily typed back slowly, her fingers steady now. You were innocent. That's all that matters. Now keep working your program. Show everyone that my faith wasn't misplaced. Don't give them a reason to look back. I will, the reply came instantly. I swear I will. You won't regret this. Emily hoped he was right because the stakes had just been raised to a level she hadn't anticipated. She hadn't just saved a Marine. She had declared war on a corrupt command structure, and she knew the ripples of this would be felt for a long time. Chen knocked on her door, his face lit by the blue light of his tablet. Boss, you better turn on the news. It's already hitting the local stations. Emily grabbed the remote and flicked on the small television in the corner of her office. The local news anchor was speaking over a graphic of the base. Breaking tonight, a Marine captain stationed at Camp Pendleton has been placed under arrest by NCIS for evidence tampering in connection with a drug testing case. Sources tell us Captain Harold Reynolds allegedly planted illegal substances in a Marine sample to influence a separate investigation. The Marine in question, who had previously been involved in a viral video, has been fully exonerated. Emily's phone began to vibrate almost immediately. Media requests, calls from other commands, messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. She silenced it and set it face down on the desk. "Boss," Chen asked, leaning against the doorframe. "You okay?" "I'm fine," Emily said, though she felt anything but. "I'm just trying to figure out how a simple case of a bar fight turned into a federal criminal investigation." "Because you don't take the easy road," Chen said, a small, respectful smile touching his lips. "You take the right one even when it's covered in thorns." She stayed late that night, long after the rest of the building had gone dark. She worked through the mountain of reports that would form the foundation of the case against Reynolds. She knew the defense would come after her judgment, her methods, and her history. They would try to make it look like she had a vendetta. But she had the truth, and for once, the truth was enough. At 2300, her father called. "I saw the news," he said. "No greeting, no pleasantries. You took down a captain, Emily." "I exposed a crime, Dad," she corrected. "There's a difference." He was silent for a moment. "Do you understand the target you've put on your back? There are people in the Corps who will see this as you going after one of their own to prove a point. They won't care about the evidence, they'll care about the optics. You've made some very powerful enemies today. Let them be enemies," Emily said, her voice tired but firm. "I'd rather have enemies and a clean conscience than friends and a soul I've sold for the sake of optics." Reynolds framed a man. He used his rank as a weapon. If I'd let that go, I'd be just as guilty as he is. Her father sighed, a sound of both frustration and, she realized with a start, pride. "You were always too much like your mother. You don't know how to let a fire burn itself out. You have to run into the middle of it with a bucket. Just watch your back, Emily. This isn't over." "I know, Dad, I know." When they hung up, Emily sat in the quiet of her office, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. She thought about the cost of what she'd done. She thought about the career she had spent years building and how easily it could be dismantled by the very people she served. But then she remembered an email she had received earlier that evening, one she hadn't had time to process. She opened her laptop and found it. It was from Sergeant Patterson, the veteran who had reached out to her after the first video of Jason White had surfaced. "Commander Stark," the email began. "I wanted you to know that watching you fight for that Marine, even when it put your own reputation at risk, gave me the courage to finally reach out for help. I'm starting therapy next week. I'm working on the anger that's been eating me alive since I got home. I'm doing it because you showed me what real strength looks like. It's not about being the toughest or the loudest. It's about being willing to do the right thing even when it costs you everything. Thank you for being the leader we needed." Emily read the words twice, the tightness in her chest finally beginning to ease. She looked down at Ace, who was watching her with his intelligent, soulful eyes. "It was worth it," she whispered to the empty room. The battle with Reynolds was just beginning. The legal proceedings would be long, the media scrutiny would be intense, and the political blowback would be severe. But as she packed her bag and prepared to leave the office, Emily didn't feel the weight of the coming storm. She felt a strange, quiet sense of peace. She had done her job. She had protected the innocent and exposed the guilty. In a world of gray areas and shifting loyalties, she had found a line in the sand and stood her ground. 6 weeks after the arrest of Captain Reynolds, the air around Marine Corps headquarters felt different. The tension hadn't vanished, but it had shifted from a frantic, panicked energy to a heavy, somber anticipation. Emily stood outside a large, oak-paneled conference room, the brass on her uniform catching the overhead light. She took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of the world on her shoulders, but this time she wasn't carrying it alone. She glanced down at Ace, who sat perfectly still by her side, a silent sentinel in the heart of the storm. The door opened, and a young lieutenant stepped out, nodding to her. "The board is ready for you, Commander." Emily squared her shoulders, adjusted her cover, and stepped into the room. The morning sun bled through the high, narrow windows of the legal proceedings room, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished linoleum floor. Lieutenant Commander Emily Stark stood in the hallway, her breath coming in slow, measured cycles. She could feel the weight of her dress uniform, the fabric pressed so crisply it felt like armor. Every medal, every ribbon was a testament to a career built on integrity. But today, that same career felt like it was balanced on the edge of a razor. Beside her, Ace sat with a stoic patience that only a highly trained working dog could muster. His coat was brushed to a mirror sheen, his harness snug. He was more than a service animal in this moment. He was an anchor. Inside that room, a preliminary hearing would determine whether Captain Harold Reynolds faced a full court-martial or if the allegations against him would be swept under the rug of military bureaucracy. Emily was the star witness, the one who had pulled the thread that threatened to unravel a senior officer's life. Chen stood beside her, his presence a quiet, steadying force. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of the cracks he knew must be forming beneath the surface. He asked quietly if she was ready for what was about to happen. Emily looked toward the heavy oak doors and admitted that she wasn't. But as she told him, being unready had never stopped her before. The door groaned open, and Captain Morrison gestured for her to enter. The atmosphere inside was stifling. It was a room packed with people, yet it felt eerily silent, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Reynolds sat at the defense table, looking every bit the decorated Marine. Beside him was his lawyer, a lieutenant colonel with eyes like flint, and a reputation for dismantling junior officers with the precision of a surgeon. Major Hayes, the prosecutor, gave Emily a curt, professional nod, acknowledging the storm they were about to walk into together. At the head of the long table sat Colonel Briggs, the presiding officer. His face looked as though it had been carved from a block of granite, weathered and unreadable, his eyes reflecting nothing but the cold facts of the law. Colonel Briggs broke the silence, his voice a low rumble that filled the room. He thanked Lieutenant Commander Stark for her presence and signaled for the proceedings to begin. Emily took her seat at the witness table, feeling the coldness of the chair through her uniform. Ace settled at her feet, a warm weight against her ankles that reminded her she wasn't alone. Across the room, Reynolds refused to meet her gaze. His jaw was set so tight it looked painful, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table. Even without eye contact, Emily could feel the waves of animosity rolling off him. It was a physical heat, a silent, screaming hatred that filled the space between them. Major Hayes stood up, adjusting his jacket before beginning. He asked her to walk the room through the events that had led to the investigation. Emily took a deep, steadying breath, closing her eyes for a split second to center her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was clear and methodical. She started from the beginning, the bar incident involving Corporal Jason White, her controversial decision to offer conditions instead of immediate charges, and the fierce, almost personal opposition she had faced from Reynolds. She detailed the suspicious timing of White's positive drug test, which had occurred precisely when Reynolds needed a win to discredit her. She spoke of the security footage, the testimony of Staff Sergeant Mills, and the independent retest that had cleared White's name entirely. Hayes leaned in, asking the pivotal question. At what point did she begin to suspect Captain Reynolds of actual tampering? Emily didn't blink. She told him it was the moment the timing became too perfect. She explained that 3 days after she had put her own reputation on the line to vouch for a Marine, that same Marine suddenly tested positive for cocaine. It was exactly what Reynolds needed to prove her judgment was flawed. To her, that wasn't a coincidence. It was a convenience that defied logic. The defense attorney was on his feet instantly, his voice sharp with indignation. He objected, claiming Emily was speculating about his client's motives. Colonel Briggs sustained the objection with a sharp rap of his gavel, instructing Emily to stick to the facts rather than her interpretations of them. Emily nodded, redirecting her testimony without losing her stride. She laid out the cold, hard reality. Captain Reynolds had sole access to the sample during a critical 4-hour window. Staff Sergeant Mills had documented a tampered seal. The independent retest showed no drugs in White's system. Someone had added pharmaceutical-grade cocaine to that sample, and Reynolds had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to be that someone. The defense attorney pounced again, his voice dripping with skepticism. He demanded to know what possible motive a Marine captain would have to frame one of his own men. Emily met his eyes with a level of steadiness that seemed to unnerve him. She explained that it was about shifting the blame away from a toxic command climate. She pointed out that Reynolds' company had seen 7 alcohol-related incidents in just 12 months, a pattern that reflected a massive failure in leadership. But if one of those incidents was suddenly about hard drugs, the narrative shifted. It became a story about a screening failure, not a command failure. It protected his career at the expense of a young Marine's life. The lawyer shouted that it was pure speculation, but Emily countered that it was pattern recognition, the very thing they were trained to do as officers. She argued that Captain Reynolds had a problem and implemented a solution. It just happened to be an illegal one. The defense attorney's face flushed a deep, angry red, his mouth opening to retort, but Colonel Briggs held up a hand, silencing the room. He turned his attention to Major Hayes, asking for the forensic evidence. Hayes produced a thick folder, the sound of rustling paper loud in the quiet room. He distributed documents to the table, explaining that the lab analysis proved the cocaine in the original sample was pharmaceutical grade, not the street-level quality typically found in recreational use. Its purity was consistent with supplies found in evidence lockers. Then came the killing blow. Inventory records showed that cocaine had been signed out from the base evidence locker just 2 days before White's test. The signature on the requisition form belonged to Captain Reynolds. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The color drained from Reynolds' face, leaving him looking sickly in the harsh overhead lights. His lawyer tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, but Hayes was relentless. He pointed to the paper trail, the signed forms, the security video of Reynolds entering and leaving the locker, and the testimony from the custodian who claimed Reynolds had said he needed the sample for a training demonstration that never took place. Colonel Briggs leaned forward, his eyes boring into Reynolds. He asked the captain if he had any explanation for why he had signed out cocaine 2 days before a subordinate tested positive for the same substance. The defense lawyer put a restraining hand on Reynolds' arm, but Reynolds shook him off with a jerky, violent motion. He ground out that he wasn't answering that. Briggs nodded slowly, noting that his silence would be heavily factored into the final recommendation. Emily watched as the man's arrogance finally crumbled. The weight of evidence he couldn't talk his way around was finally crushing him. There was no satisfaction in it for her, only a profound sense of sadness that a career could end in such a disgraceful, self-inflicted heap. The hearing stretched on for 2 more grueling hours. It was a slow, agonizing process of building a case so airtight that even the defense looked defeated by the end. When a recess was finally called, Emily stepped out into the hallway, her lungs craving fresh air. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Jason White, telling her he was outside the building. He knew he wasn't supposed to be there, but he felt he needed to be close to support her the way she had supported him. Emily felt a small, genuine smile tug at her lips. She texted him back, telling him to stay put and that she would find him when it was over. As she moved toward the exit, a woman in her mid-50s approached her. She had tired eyes and a jaw set with a determination that looked painfully familiar. She introduced herself as Jennifer Reynolds, Harold's wife. Emily froze, expecting an attack, but the woman held up her hands in a gesture of peace. She wasn't there to yell, she was there to apologize. Emily was caught completely off guard. Jennifer's voice shook as she spoke of their 23 years of marriage. She had watched her husband climb the ranks, becoming more obsessed with his career and more willing to cut corners. She had convinced herself it was just ambition, just the pressure of the job, but what he had done to Corporal White was a line she couldn't ignore. Jennifer looked at Emily with a mixture of heartbreak and respect. She acknowledged that her husband was going to lose everything, his career, his pension, and likely his freedom. It was her life falling apart too, yet she wanted Emily to know that she had done the right thing. She had protected an innocent man, and Jennifer didn't want her to doubt that for a second. Before Emily could find the words to respond, the woman turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing in the corridor feeling as though she had been punched and hugged at the exact same time. Chen appeared at her side, signaling that they were ready to reconvene. The afternoon session shifted its focus to Corporal White. When he took the stand, he looked small in his dress uniform, his hands trembling as he was sworn in. But as he began to speak, his voice grew steadier. He spoke about how he had once respected Reynolds, but that everything changed after the bar incident. He described being called into the captain's office and being told he had embarrassed the Corps. He recounted the way Reynolds had looked at him when he announced the random drug test. It wasn't a procedure, it was a threat. Jason testified that he had never touched cocaine in his life. He spoke of the sheer terror he felt when the test came back positive, knowing that a dishonorable discharge would ruin his life and leave his pregnant wife and unborn daughter with a father who was a disgrace. Tears filled his eyes as he explained why he had reached out to Emily. He said she was the only person who had believed in him when she had no reason to. She had investigated when she could have walked away. She had saved his life and his family because it was the right thing to do, not because it was easy. The defense tried to rattle him during cross-examination, bringing up his history with alcohol. Jason didn't flinch. He admitted he had a problem but stated clearly that he was 90 days sober. He had the records to prove his whereabouts and his sobriety during the window when the drug use supposedly occurred. The lawyer tried to claim Jason was lying out of loyalty to Emily, but the young Marine shut him down. He told the court that the evidence spoke for itself. He was clean, the test said otherwise, and the man with the motive and the access was sitting right across from him. Before the hearing adjourned, Colonel Briggs turned his gaze back to Emily. He asked her one final heavy question. If she could do it all over again, knowing the destruction it would cause to a fellow officer's career, would she still choose not to press charges against Corporal White? Emily didn't hesitate for even a second. She said yes. She told the colonel that she hadn't destroyed Reynolds' career. He had done that himself the moment he chose to commit a federal crime. She spoke about the duty of an officer to choose the right path over the convenient one. She said she would always give mercy for mistakes, but that choices carried consequences. The room remained silent for a long moment after she finished. Briggs finally nodded and adjourned the hearing, promising a recommendation within 48 hours. The weight of the last 6 weeks hit Emily all at once as she stepped back into the hallway. Her legs felt like lead, and the adrenaline that had been sustaining her began to evaporate. Chen caught her elbow, sensing her fatigue. They made it outside to the fresh air where Jason was waiting. When he saw her, he didn't speak. He simply came to attention and delivered the sharpest salute Emily had ever seen. She returned it, then reached out to shake his hand. Jason told her that thank you wasn't enough, but Emily brushed it off. She told him he had done the hard work of staying sober and keeping his head down. She had just opened the door. He then asked if she would meet his wife. A young woman, Sarah, approached carrying a small child. She looked Emily in the eye and thanked her for the fact that her daughter, Emma, would grow up with a father at home. She told Emily that she had provided salvation for their family when everyone else had given up on them. The baby reached out for Ace, and with Emily's permission, the massive dog lowered his head to let the child's tiny fingers tangle in his fur. The giggles of the baby were the first truly light sound Emily had heard in weeks. Sarah then revealed that the baby's name, Emma, was chosen to honor Emily. The realization hit Emily hard, a lump forming in her throat that made it impossible to speak. She watched as the White family walked away, Sarah's arm around Jason, the three of them heading toward a future that had almost been erased. 2 days later, the formal recommendation arrived. Captain Harold Reynolds would face a full court-martial. The evidence was so overwhelming that a conviction was considered a foregone conclusion. The news hit the military community like a shockwave. Emily's phone became a source of constant noise, media requests, interview offers, and messages from colleagues. She ignored all of them. Her commander issued a brief statement praising her integrity, and the Navy Times even ran a piece calling her the new model for military leadership. There was even talk of a petition for an early promotion. Emily hated the spotlight. She told Chen it wasn't about her, but he disagreed. He told her that people needed heroes, and whether she liked it or not, she had become one by standing up when it mattered. 3 months passed. The world had moved on to other scandals, but the impact of the case remained. Emily was back in her office when her father called to tell her that Reynolds had been sentenced to 15 years and a dishonorable discharge. They had thrown the book at him. Her father seemed surprised by her lack of sympathy for a fellow officer, but Emily was firm. She told him that she had watched the man try to destroy a family just to save his own ego. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. Then her father's voice softened with pride. He told her that the promotion board had met. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. Despite the success of the investigation, she knew that being a whistleblower or a troublemaker could often stall a career in the upper echelons of the military. But her father gave her the news. She had made the list. She was being promoted to commander. He told her that her grandfather would have been proud, and that he certainly was. After the call, Emily sat in the silence of her office, Ace resting his head on her knee. She thought about the ripple effects of a single decision. She thought about a letter she had received from a veteran named Patterson, who told her he had stayed sober for 90 days because her story had shown him that true strength was about having the power to destroy someone and choosing to help them instead. She realized then that the promotion and the accolades were secondary. The true reward was the lives that had been altered for the better. She sent a quick text to Jason asking how the family was doing. The reply came back almost instantly. They were thriving. Jason had been promoted to sergeant and Sarah was back in school. Little Emma had taken her first steps. They were good, he said, because of her. Emily smiled, a deep sense of peace finally settling over her. 6 weeks later, Emily stood on a stage in front of a sea of young Marines. Jason White stood beside her, and together they told their story to the next generation of leaders. She didn't sugarcoat it. She spoke about the assault, the drugs, the tampering, and the crushing pressure to just go along with the status quo. She watched their faces. Some were confused, some were inspired, but all were listening. A young Lance Corporal asked her how she knew Jason was worth saving. Emily was honest. She told him she didn't know for sure, but she knew he deserved the chance to prove himself. She told them that leadership wasn't just about punishment. It was about creating the conditions for success. Another Marine asked how an officer like Reynolds could fall so far. Emily explained that he had forgotten a fundamental truth: rank doesn't make you right. She told them that authority without integrity was nothing more than tyranny in a uniform. She spent an hour answering questions, trying to pass on the hard-won lessons of the past few months. When it was over, dozens of Marines lined up to shake her hand. As she walked to her car in the cooling evening air, Jason caught up with her one last time. He thanked her again, his voice thick with emotion. Emily looked at the man he had become, sober, responsible, and a leader in his own right. She told him that he was the one who had made the choice to be better. She had just made sure he had the opportunity to do so. He saluted her, a final gesture of profound respect, and promised not to waste the life she had helped him keep. Driving away from the base with Ace in the passenger seat, Emily felt a quiet certainty. She knew that in the years to come, she would be promoted again, she would take command of her own unit, and she would continue to face difficult choices. She knew that Jason would go on to help others struggling with the same demons he had faced. She knew that Reynolds would eventually be released as a broken man, a ghost of the officer he had once been. But in that moment, none of the future mattered. All that mattered was the knowledge that when the pressure was at its peak, she hadn't folded. She had chosen the harder road because it was the only one that led to justice. That choice defined her more than any rank ever could. It was a core of integrity that no one could ever take away, a quiet flame that would light her way through whatever storms were yet to come. She reached over and ruffled Ace's ears, and as the city lights blurred past, she knew they were more than just okay. They were exactly where they were supposed to be.